You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome once again to HorrorBabble. We're delighted to present the complete DAMP Man Trilogy for your listening pleasure today, ladies and gents. Prepare to enter a weird world of hostile late-night pursuits and scientific experiments gone wrong. The Damp Man by Allison V. Harding. 1. George Pelgrim sat with exaggerated boredom on the uncomfortable wood benches of the amphitheater. The sign above the several rows proclaimed that this was the section reserved for the press, but George, as his sprawled long legs and discontented manner indicated, was neither impressed by the sign nor the spectacle going on beneath him in the pool where the Women's State Swimming Championships were being held. Despite his comparatively young years, Pelgrim had covered a newspaper reporter's average quota of big stories, including those of the sports variety. This was a come-down. More than that, it was an out-and-out indignity, and for at least the 10th time that day, Pelgrim reviewed the disadvantages of working for a big, short-handed metropolitan daily, with the inevitable shuffling of assignments to its younger members that short-handedness dictated. Still, covering something like a girls' swimming meet, and a relatively obscure one at that, was going too far. He'd taken a lot from McBrien, his editor, but this was... 5 similar forms splashed mightily below him, and one in a red cap finally forged ahead and touched the pool's end. The PA system then announced that the 100-yard freestyle winner was Miss Linda Mallory. Second was Miss Mary Cyphers, the former title holder in this event. George yawned. Thank God it was the last event. He slouched out of the stands, passing by the public relations table to pick up a press sheet with events, winners, and times. Now, a few words from the new 100-yard champion, and he'd be through his day's work. He took his time getting to the clubhouse, and then he flashed his press pass at the doorway that proclaimed, "No visitors, contestants' entrance." He nodded to a timer he recognized as someone he'd seen several times before at track meets. Oh, happy days. Then he buttonholed one of the ribboned committeemen. "I'd like to see that girl who won the 100-yard. Just a few words." He looked down at his sheet. "Mallory?" "Ah, yes, Miss Mallory," said the committeeman, filled with be-nice-to-the-press resolutions. "A fine swimmer." He beckoned to the newspaperman to follow him, and went down a corridor, stopping before a door, knocking on it, and then sticking his head in to murmur a few words. Then he turned back. "Go right in." Pelgrim went in. Linda Mallory was standing just inside. Pelgrim got the impression of well-built blondness. She was dressed in street clothes now. "I'm Pelgrim, of the Gazette," he mumbled. "I'd just like a few words, Miss Mallory. Is this the first district championship you've won? How old are you?" He shot forth a few other questions. Get it over with as soon as possible, Pelgrim. Then, for the first time, he really looked at her. She was very pretty, if you like the big, healthy, athletic type. But there was something else. One shapely arm was holding onto the dressing table as though she needed its support. George's eyes narrowed. This was a strange way for a newly crowned champion to act. She ought to be pleased. Instead, Linda Mallory was terrified. There was an awkward silence, and then the girl managed the ghost of a smile. "I'm sorry," she said, and squared her shoulders. "I'm 20, and this is the first time I've won a county championship. It's very nice." Her voice trailed off, and she didn't look as though she thought there was anything nice about it. Okay. Thanks, Miss Mallory. George's puzzlement at the girl's anxiety was being submerged by his indignation at having this assignment. He turned on his heel. Wait a minute, please. She touched his arm imperatively. Did you see anyone outside in the hall or coming through the clubhouse? A large man, fat, that is, in a dark suit with... George frowned. Didn't notice. Say, are you all right, Miss Mallory? I mean, are you sick or anything? She shook her head. No, I'm all right. I just wondered if you'd seen this person. I'm afraid I haven't been much good at being interviewed. I've got enough, replied Pelgrim, and he stepped to the door. About this friend of yours. I wouldn't worry, though. He'll find you. Yes, said Linda Mallory. I guess he will. The best part of the day for Pelgrim started 20 minutes later, when he ran into Al Holden entirely unexpectedly. He filed his story hurriedly, and left the telegrapher's office arm in arm with Al. There were many, "You old son of a gun, haven't seen you since." He and his former pal repaired to the nearest bistro, and within a few minutes all thoughts of Linda Mallory had gone from Pelgrim's consciousness. He had enough presence of mind come 6:25, though, to slap Holden on the back. It's been great, Al, but I've got to run. That old buzzard boss of mine has probably got 3 or 4 other jobs for his errand boys tonight. He made the 6:45 train to the city and settled into an empty seat, pleasantly mellowed by the 5 or 6 drinks and the realization that he had a 3/4 of an hour ride before he reached town, with the possibilities therein contained for a little nap. He was dreaming gently of riding a huge rubber sea serpent in Central Park Lake, when the sea serpent reached up a suddenly grown tentacle and began to shake him. He did what he could, but the sea serpent was persistent. George woke up and looked into Linda Mallory's startled face. It was her hand on his arm. Mr. Pelgrim, I'm so sorry. I saw you and sat down here in the seat next to you. I'm scared, Mr. Pelgrim. He's on this train. Still only half awake, the only thing the reporter could think of was the sea serpent, and where Linda Mallory came in with the sea serpent was more than he could figure out. He straightened against the car seat, with the self-conscious air of someone who is silently saying that of course he wasn't really asleep. He looked at the girl's agitated face, and then took her hand because it seemed the thing to do. It was a nice hand, cool. Or maybe that was because he'd had those drinks with Al Holden. Or maybe it was because she was so frightened. Now listen, he spoke in the heavy, paternal manner of someone of his years to another person not too many years younger. What's this all about? He remembered her as someone so self-possessed and confident that afternoon in her blue bathing suit with the red cap. Now she was, well, almost pathetic. Pelgrim was good at listening. He listened. He nodded at the right times and looked straight ahead, hoping his breath wasn't still 100% alcoholic. After all, you don't meet an old friend like Al Holden every day, and that was a good excuse to top off a few. Linda Mallory's story was straightforward and well expressed, he analyzed. The telling of it seemed to help her. Anyway, she was less agitated at the finish. She was from the West. From the earliest she could remember, she told Pelgrim, she just had an aunt in the world, and an ability to swim faster than the other kids in school. Her hometown had first sent her east to compete in a small meet, and she'd won. There were the usual offers then to compete in other meets. In the meantime, she'd gotten a modest job in an office in town. She could type, and everything seemed fine, until one day she'd met him. It was just recently. She'd competed in a meet, and had been walking to the clubhouse when this man had loomed up in front of her. He'd said something she wasn't quite sure now, like, "You are to be mine," or some such strange statement. He'd held his arms out to her, maybe beseechingly, maybe threateningly, she wasn't sure. She dodged his advances and brushed on by hurriedly, but he was outside when she'd left the dressing quarters. He'd followed her to the bus the swimmers took back to town. She'd boarded it, heaving a sigh of relief as his gross figure faded in the distance when they got under way. Then, miraculously, he turned up one morning not many days later, sitting in the lobby of her hotel. He'd followed her through the streets. He'd been outside her office when she left at 5:30. Once, she'd called a policeman, but when the officer had turned to look in the direction she indicated, there was no one. He was clever, this big man. Pelgrim thought to himself, well, why not? There are plenty of these cranks around. You don't need to work on a newspaper to realize that. And she's a cute kid. She was. Aloud he asked, "You think you saw him this afternoon out at the meet, and you think he's on this train?" She nodded. "I know he is, Mr. Pelgrim." "Well, we'll look into that. And in the meantime, cut out the Mr. Pelgrim business. A lot of people have worse names for me, but let's compromise, and you call me George. Just what does this man look like?" Linda shuddered. He's awful. I don't know how to describe him exactly, except that he's very big and fat, and he always has on a dark suit like a chauffeur's suit. But it isn't really. But you know that dark material. And his face is lumpy and kind of swollen, and his eyes scare me too. I tell you, George, that time I came downstairs in my hotel and saw him sitting there, those eyes looked at me over a newspaper he'd been reading. It made me feel all... She shuddered again. "You sit tight," George advised. "I'm gonna see if I can spot him." "He's back of us," Linda Mallory indicated. "I saw him get on the end of the train." George got up and tried to look formidable. Maybe walking would clear the last "great to see you, Al Holden" cobwebs out of his brain. He smiled and pointed towards the back. He went this way. Linda smiled back. "Look, is this the right thing to do? I mean, don't get into any trouble on account of me." "I'm interested. I want to see this fascinated fan of yours for myself." He left her sitting there, looking after him. There were 1, 2, 3, 4 cars behind theirs. The reporter walked slowly down the aisle, hands thrust deep in his pockets, looking casually from side to side. The usual assortment of flower-dressed ladies, candy-eating children, men with their papers. A couple of long stouts with papers. In the last car, one had on a brown suit. The other had on sort of a grey and darkish sort of suit. He was buried in his paper, too. Looked pretty big from the shoulders. The train slowed for a suburban station and stopped. George stood on the back platform with his eyes on the big fellow's back, undecided. Then he started up the aisle, retracing his steps. When he came abreast of the suspect, he bobbed his head down. "Pardon me." He thumbed at an item in the paper. The fellow's face came out the other side of the tabloid. "Friend of mine," murmured George apologetically. The stranger's face was belligerent. It was also long, thin, and hoarse. It looked as though it were backed up by a good wallop. George smilingly backed away. It wasn't the man. The train started up again. Maybe he'd missed the guy the first time, or maybe he'd gotten off. George got back to his car and rehearsed a small speech. It was an excuse to hold her nice, capable hand again. He'd say, "There's nothing to worry about. Believe me, I fingerprinted all the guys back there. There's nobody answering your 3-state alarm on the train." But there was no speech, because Linda Mallory was gone, and she wasn't on the train. George assured himself of that by looking through the forward cars. He fumed the rest of the way into town. 3 days later, Pelgrim's desk phone jangled. It was Linda. Despite himself, he'd wondered about her, even though with proper repertorial cynicism he told himself the whole business was probably screwy. Well, why the vanishing act? She apologized fervently. But I had to. Just after you'd gone up the aisle out of the car, he appeared. I couldn't stand it. I got off at the next stop. George hummed. Could I talk to you sometime? George, with studied effort, answered slowly. Well, I guess so. Where are you? Linda Mallory gave the name of a hotel. I'll come up this evening, he said, and hung up. As he sat at his desk, the reporter realized he wasn't at all sure about Linda Mallory, about a lot of things concerning her. He admitted to himself reluctantly, though, that he was sure of one thing. He was glad to hear from her. That night, he arrived in the lobby of her building at the appointed time. It was a women's hotel, and the downstairs was filled with potted palms and waiting males. She was there standing by the desk, and he thought mentally that the simple blue dress became her. She certainly didn't look like someone suffering from hallucinations. He liked the way she stuck her hand out when she saw him, and her smile. He'd liked that before. Let's sit over here. She motioned towards an off-the-floor alcove, where there were a couple of chairs. He followed. She looked at him intently. If I were you, I'd probably think I was crazy. He smiled. My sentiments almost exactly, Pelgrim replied. I really don't have any right to get you into this, and you've been very kind. And to what? He persisted. After all, if you don't mind my saying so, and if you do, I'll still say it, aren't you getting a little overwrought about the attentions of a fan of yours? He's been here, she went on, ignoring his question. I think he got off just as I did at that station. I got a bus, but he followed me. Look, if this thing is bothering you so much, George suggested, why not get the police in on it? I mean, really, a man sitting in your hotel lobby, following you to your job, shadowing you home from work. You've got a perfect right to. He's clever, she said, and the fear look came back into her eyes. I told you before. Once in the street I spoke to an officer. He seems to anticipate. I mean, he was just gone when the policeman looked. Last night, George, I worked late. When I came out, I didn't see him. I didn't look for him very hard. I guess I thought that he'd have gotten tired waiting for me. I went to a restaurant a couple of blocks away from here, and when I came out, it was pitch dark. I was walking, not thinking of anything, you understand, not expecting to hear anything, when I heard his steps behind me. You can't miss the sound. It's the sort of noise wet crepe rubber makes. I guess I lost my head. I ran the rest of the way here. Then I stood just inside the door and looked outside. I didn't see him again. Pelgrim thought that over for a minute. Tell you, what you need is to get out of here for a little while. Stop thinking about it. Let's go to a show or something. She brightened. That'd be swell. All right. I'll wait right here, and you go upstairs and get your coat. He saw her disappear into the shining maw of the elevator. Then his eyes wandered over the people in the lobby. His spot was advantageous. From his side alcove, he could see without himself being noticed. Harmless enough looking, everybody was. His mind, running over the things Linda Mallory had told him, turned a sudden flip-flop, landing in a new position. This man, this follower she complained of and seemed so frightened of. It was strange no one else ever noticed him. He himself, for instance, or the policeman Linda admitted having spoken to one day on the street. There were all these episodes, these macabre details of some ungainly creature trailing her through the streets and everywhere, and yet no one, apparently, but Linda Mallory ever saw the man. George had the average college-educated young man's rudimentary knowledge of psychology. How many times in the lay press had he read of things like a persecution complex, persons thinking other people are plotting against them, following them, whispering about them, etc. Linda, in spite of her small job and her occasional swimming contests, was essentially very much alone here in the city, and he knew nothing about her background, really. It was an uncomfortable thought, one that shouldered its way into his mind rather than was welcomed there. But newspaper work demands objectivity, and this conclusion was at least a possible one, based on the facts as he knew them. He could admit to himself that Linda Mallory was attractive, straightforward, and nice. There was a simplicity about her that pleased him, and yet fear had been the most dominant chord in her makeup, a fixed fear about one thing that she hadn't been able to demonstrate for anyone else. Unhappy at his own thoughts, George got up and ambled towards the front door. It was hot in here. He pushed through the portal, coming out on the street. There was one small bulb set in the middle of the awning that ran out to the curb. George stepped out of its depressingly feeble circle of light, fumbling for a cigarette in his jacket pocket. As he did so, he collided with someone. The reporter mumbled, "Sorry," and the other figure moved away from him, towards the door of the hotel. George turned. He gaped. The retreating figure was that of a very large, fat man, his ungainly body fitted into a rumpled, dark cloth suit. Pelgrim flicked his cigarette into the street and followed. Inside, he saw the other man walking purposefully toward the alcove which George himself had just quit a moment or so ago. George took a few tentative steps in that direction. The man picked out the chair George had been sitting in and lowered himself heavily into it. Pelgrim had a glimpse of a fleshy, dead-white face, and then an evening paper ascended in front of the waistcoat and head, like a protective barrier. George changed his mind, turned around and headed towards the desk. It was placed near the elevators, and he would see her the moment she got down. He waited, tapping nervously on the counter. From this point, he couldn't quite see into the corner of the alcove where the man sat. Finally, the metal door of the lift opened, and Linda came out. He was at her side in an instant, and ferried her across the floor towards the door. He said something trivial, about what movie do you think we ought to see, or some such, and he purposely walked on the alcove side. As George pushed her through the door, he flashed a quick glance to one side. The big man in the dark suit was still sitting there, the paper still in front of him, but it had lowered just a trifle, just enough to show a pair of eyes, and the eyes were on them. They decided on a movie nearby. As they walked, George said to himself, "Now you mustn't look back. You'll make her nervous." And yet look back was what he wanted to do, more than anything else, and still he couldn't be sure. There were other large men in dark suits who sat around, reading papers. Pelgrim tried listening. But have you ever attempted to pick out a particular set of footsteps on a street in a crowded city? When they got under the lighted theatre marquee, he was able to crane his neck. He spotted no one in the square of yellow light, or on its outskirts. They went in and sat halfway down on the right side. The double feature was a whodunit and a comedy. Linda laughed at the slapstick, and George was pleased. It meant she was forgetting herself some, enjoying herself. He murmured to her, "I've got a call into the office. Be back in just a sec." It was a half-truth. The phone to his paper was not imperative, but Pelgrim did want to do a reconnaissance. The movie audience had thinned out even more, and with his back to the screen and the reflected light shining on the empty seats, it was easy for him to see the large, bulking figure sitting 8 rows behind them. His emotions were half and half as he thumbed a nickel into the dial phone. He was annoyed and angry, and there was also a sort of creepy feeling up his back and neck because he had thought all sorts of things about Linda in the beginning. Maybe she was pulling a fake or throwing a psycho at him, and all the time there was a guy, and he did just what she said he did. He got the paper. "Hello? Is Jim Crozier there?" He was told Crozier had left half an hour earlier. He had reasons of his own for wanting to speak to the veteran newspaper man, but if he wasn't there, that was that. George hurried back down the aisle, and then he slowed as he neared it, for directly back of Linda now, the big man was sitting. He'd moved up in the couple of moments Pelgrim had been away. George moved down beside her. She was smiling at something on the screen, oblivious of anything else around her. He'd have to handle this skillfully. "Look," he said, "I'm sorry, but it looks as though we ought to head out. We must be almost up to where we came in." He hated to take the kid away from this thing. She seemed to be enjoying it, but she nodded, good sport that she was. He pushed her hurriedly down the row and maneuvered her up the aisle so she wouldn't notice. "I'm sorry," Linda Mallory apologized when they got outside. "You shouldn't have spent so much time with me tonight, should you?" He sighed in mock tragedy and tried to make his tones light. "They'll probably have me back filling inkwells in the morning." They stopped at an all-night eatery, and over a cup of coffee, George made a decision. The whole thing was queer and mysterious enough without adding unnecessarily to those factors. The diner clock said that it was after 12. The streets were deserted as they walked from out of the oblong of light thrown down by the eatery's windows. A soft spring fog had crept in from the sea, muffling the sound of occasional midnight traffic, swathing the lonely street lamps in ghostly halos, and cutting visibility to not many yards. They walked between rows of brick-fronted houses that were lonely and ghostly, as though they had never known human habitation, and their steps echoed soddenly from the pavements. It was in the middle of one dingy block that George felt Linda's fingers tighten on his arm. Her hearing had been perhaps keener than his, but when the dying sound of a distant L train was completely gone, he knew too that there were footsteps behind them. He looked at Linda Mallory. Her red mouth was partly open, as though there were a question which she feared to ask. He put his fingers over his hand. "What's the matter?" He smiled, even though he knew. They both knew. They walked on, and as though by mutual consent their steps were faster, but there seemed no end to this long, black block, and the sounds behind them were more clearly defined. Perhaps because their senses were keyed so high and sent so completely backwards toward the one focus point, or perhaps because the steps were actually nearer, gaining on them. You know how it is when you're a child somewhere in the darkness of night, or in the darkness of an old house, or in the darkness of your own imagination. The mad, irresistible urge that sweeps over you suddenly, so suddenly to flee with all the strength of your being, to run, to hide. There is some of that in all of us at certain times. It touched George briefly, a touch of darkness and fog, the run-and-hide urge, and he felt it in Linda too, and her frightened look at him said so. With the other emotions and the thinking that was going on in his head, there was still room for pity for her. She'd had this unpleasant thing to fight with before and before. He was new to it, and the newness must be worth something, he resolved. Take it easy. he murmured to her. She worked a little grin. "I just know I'd be sprinting by now if I were alone," Linda admitted. In the tunnel of darkness ahead, there beckoned the one yellow beacon of a streetlight. The single bulb glowed weakly in the sticky atmosphere. They marched toward it, and marched was the word, for George kept their paces even. It was a matter of morale, he knew instinctively, that if they once broke stride, they would run helter-skelter, an absurd mad spectacle of two very frightened people who should know better, plummeting down the lonely thoroughfare until they would trip and hurt themselves, or come suddenly upon a greater brightness and busyness of the city, and suddenly feel ashamed. Pelgrim was no fool. He thought he had calculated their situation and their chances. No casual bad man, no mugger or stick-up artist wastes his time tracking one person night after night. A big city hold-up is as impersonal as an auto accident. It is completely indiscriminate. If you happen to be on such and such a street at such and such a time, you will feel a gun in your ribs or a billy on your skull. You or anyone else. No, the lure here was the girl, and what he did not know about her could be his undoing, their undoing. And this disquieting thought made George stare at Linda again so suddenly that she felt it and looked back. He felt ashamed of himself for any suspicions he might have had. This girl was honest. She told him what she knew. There was nothing contrived that she was a party to. A kidnapping was absurd and seemed out of the question. There were easier ways. This long surveillance, for instance. Why would that be necessary? And not Linda Mallory, a girl who made a tiny salary and was, at the most, only a promising swimmer of small local accomplishment. This left another field, a category as dark and dank and misty as the night. This large man was one of those myriads of persons who tramp through the city and country on some small, strange purpose of their own, small to us, but large to them. The not wholly normal people, the twisted, the insane. George wished he had a gun or a club or anything. They reached the oasis of light, and he told her quickly, "You stand on the other side of it. Do you know the way to your hotel from here?" She nodded. "Sure?" She nodded again. "Just stand there. Don't say anything. Don't do anything. But if I tell you to run, run as fast as you can, and keep running, until you get where there are some more people, or you see a policeman, or you reach your hotel. Don't stop for anything else. You understand?" She nodded for the third time. "But what about you?" "I'm gonna try and find out about this guy. Linda, there must be some explanation to this." He hoped it sounded good, the way he put it. Maybe he thinks you're his long-lost daughter or something. The steps were much nearer now, and Pelgrim could see what she meant about wet, crepe-rubber soles, almost a sloshing sound on the damp pavements. Linda backed away from him into the shadows on the other side of the circle of luminance. Satisfied, the reporter turned and faced the way they'd come. He took a few steps into the darkness, turned his head to look once more where Linda was. Good. From here, even knowing she was there, he could hardly make out her figure, and he waited. The sound seemed an endless number of heartbeats, of deep anticipatory breaths, and then out of the blackness loomed up a greater blackness. It was the large man, looking even larger than George had remembered him, looking out of the night itself, with his dark suit and midnight fedora. The steps stopped. The man stopped not a pace away from Pelgrim. The light shone on his lumpy, whitish face. The thin street lamp light and shadows made more grotesqueness of the ungainly figure and the pads of flesh that were hands and jowls. George stepped nearer quickly. Attack was his only plan. "You following someone, bud?" Closer. He was appalled by the repulsiveness of the man. The eyes were one color black. They had no depth, no expression. They were simply round discs, like the button gimlets of a cod, exhibited in the window of a fish store. There was something else about the man that came over George, suddenly freezing him with a horror that was hard to control. He looked like someone George remembered years ago. A bloated body grappling irons had pulled out of the river one cold night onto a police launch deck. The skin looked like this, the puffiness and the blue-whiteness, the eyes expressionless with death. You don't see a thing like that often. But dead men don't speak. This one said, "Where is she?" And there was a flash of something unreadable in the dark, ugly eyes. The voice was deep with a resonant, barrel-like quality. The words were spoken slowly. "Where's who?" shot back Pelgrim. "The girl. What do you want with her? You've got a hell of a nerve, mister." The big fellow's eyes stopped their peripatetic course and fixed themselves over the reporter's shoulder. Without looking, Pelgrim knew Linda had been spotted. He sensed the big body before him gathering itself, and he dove forward just as the other man lunged. As George drove his fists, he yelled, "Run, Linda, run!" And above the sound of that message's echo in the lonely street, he heard her heels clicking away furiously. His fists pounded into the spongy, monstrous hulk, and then a heavy fat hand smacked into the side of his neck, making his senses reel. George almost went down, but clung to a thick, flaying arm. The large man reached forward, a shoulder caught him, and George went to his knees, grabbing a leg. The big man grunted. George saw the kick coming too late. It landed between his eyes, and then the blackness of the street and the dark bulk of his opponent were swallowed up into an even greater blackness. The next thing George knew, he felt the pressure of an arm under his head. He blinked at the flashlight in his eyes as a voice was saying, "There now, buddy, you're coming around." He struggled to raise himself, and the light of the flashlight glanced off shiny policeman buttons. Another cop held the torch, and behind them was the white dome of a police radio car. George finally made it to his feet. There was a lump on his forehead, and his senses were still faint with more fog than the night air. He gave his name and address mechanically to the inquiring policeman, showing his press card. "You don't know who this guy was?" queried one of the uniforms. "Nope." No use telling the full story now. The important thing was to find out whether Linda had made it okay to her building. "Will you give me a lift?" He designated the street where she lived. They piled him in behind them and drove him to his destination. Almost before he got out of the police car, Linda had come through the door and was greeting him. She was shaking. "George, I was scared stiff." "Come on, let's get back inside," Pelgrim said. "George, your head." "Never mind that." He steered her towards the alcove. "Any sign of him here?" She shook her head sideways. "What happened? Those police and that head of yours." He told her quickly what had happened. "You shouldn't have made me leave you," she criticized. "You would have been a fine lot of help. No, this baby's a tough one, Linda. Now listen, I want you to go up to your room, and I want you to stay there. No matter what happens, stay there. You can't get upstairs in this building. I'll phone you in the morning. Okay?" She agreed. "This time Buster has overstepped himself. We'll get that guy, Linda. Don't worry." "What? Who is he?" she asked. "I mean, what's it all about, George?" The fear look he hated to see was there again, but he couldn't blame her. "There's something else I want to ask you, George." Yeah? When you fought with him just now, did he grab hold of you at any time, or did you touch him?" Pelgrim smiled wryly and motioned to his forehead. "A pretty good grab, don't you think?" "I mean," she persisted, "there's something about that man that's not right. I told you the time at the swimming meet he took hold of my arms, and then I had to push him away. It was, well, it was almost as though he'd been in swimming. Did you notice anything strange like that?" George laughed raucously. "You think the bird is dead? Someone come back from a watery grave? Your Uncle Egbert, who sailed before the mast and died on the Spanish Main." "Don't laugh," she protested. "It's just that He's flesh and blood, Linda. There's nothing dead about him." "I didn't quite mean that." "Well, stop meaning or thinking anything," the reporter ordered. "Go upstairs to your room and get some sleep. Forget it. I know that's pap advice, but it's best. I'll call you in the morning. All right?" They both rose. She squeezed his hand. "And thank you so much. This is my affair and my trouble, and yet you've made it yours. I don't know what I'd have done without you. Probably gone completely batty." "Forget it." He was embarrassed. "Call you in the morning." He saw her to the elevator, and only when the doors clanged shut behind her did he head for the hotel entrance. Pelgrim still felt a bit shaky, so he hailed a taxi. As they drew into the avenue, George spotted something out the side window. As they flashed by, he saw the unmistakable familiar bulk leaning casually against a mailbox, face turned towards the hotel facade. George tapped on the partition. "Cabby, wait up a minute. I want to go back." "Can't make a U-turn here, mister," the driver complained. "Against the law." The next best thing was to describe a square around the block. By the time the mailbox landmark came in sight again, though, the large man was gone. George settled back in the cab, satisfied there was nothing more he could do this night. Home in his apartment, he wrung a towel out in cold water and put it around his head. It helped the throbbing, made him think better. That little thing Linda had spoken of, what she'd noticed about this man. He'd noticed it too. The strange, abnormal wetness of those beefy, ham-like hands. Perhaps there were physical diseases that caused these things. He wouldn't know. And perhaps with them there was some sort of mental derangement that went as companion symptoms. All these things he could and would find out. In the meantime, he was going to shuffle the deck and make the Queen of Hearts disappear. 2. His alarm knocked the sleep out of him at 7:30. Within half an hour, with a shower and a coffee and eggs breakfast out of the way, he was on the phone to Linda Mallory. "Number 1, he enumerated pedantically. "I want you to pack up, Linda. Buster knows where you are. We're going to fix that. Number 2, phone that place where you work and tell them you're terribly sorry you're not coming back." He forced both points home over her mild protests. "Do anything you want around there, but don't leave the hotel. Understand?" She did. He hung up and left for the office, surprising the newspaper staff considerably, from copyboy to junior reporters, by his early arrival. He went into the office he shared with Jim Crozier and slammed the door. It was too early for the other man to be there, but George made good use of his time. By 10 o'clock, he'd located a place on the other side of town where he could get a room for Linda. It was in a respectable neighborhood, not far from a subway. By 10:30, he'd fixed it up with Mort Hoge, the Sunday feature editor, to take Linda on as a typist in that department. Crozier came in then, and Pelgrim went to town. "So, you're the number 1 crime reporter in the county." It was a joke between them, and Crozier liked it that way. Actually, the older man did know the subject. He was an expert on the history of violence, on court procedure, and the legal aspects. George outlined his experiences with Linda Mallory. At the end, the other reporter smiled. "You stuck on the girl?" Pelgrim huffed and puffed. "I see you are." Jim answered his own question. "And you haven't been drinking too much lately, have you?" "Say now, wait a minute. If you think I got this kick in the head, probably fell off a bar stool. Listen, George, the young lady evidently has other admirers besides you. This fat man is one of them. You know what they say about our present civilization and competition. You'll just have to accept it, kid." "What's that?" "No, son, it's a tough point legally to get a man arrested because you say he's been following someone. About your drunken brawl with him last night." Crozier guffawed. "I don't know." George choked down an angry retort as the other reporter turned to his typewriter. And yet hadn't he himself been skeptical in the beginning? No. He guessed he'd have to handle it himself without court orders or the police department or Crozier. There was one little thing, though, that would help. He'd get a gun. That was only feasible. He left the office at noon and took a taxi up to Linda's hotel. He buzzed her on the house phone, told her to come downstairs with her luggage. She was with him inside of 10 minutes, and he was quieting her protests. "Now, don't worry. I've got another place for you." No, she wasn't to leave the new address as a forwarding one. After a moment, they decided that she could refer any messages or mail to the swimming club she belonged to. The taxi they took drove an eccentric course until George, peering out of the back window, was satisfied there was no pursuit. Their destination was an old 5-story brownstone house. The landlady was a Mrs. Brumley, a plump, oldish woman, the widow of a former Gazette reporter. She bestowed a motherly greeting on them both. "It's good to see you," she said to Pelgrim, "and I've got the 3rd-floor rear for the young lady." George saw Linda up the creaking, carpeted stairs. Hers was a big, airy room looking out over backyards. "Like it?" "I think it's grand," Linda replied. "Okay, now. You get settled, and then tomorrow you arrive down at my newspaper office at 9 sharp. He gave her the address. "Don't expect to see me," George warned, "but they're expecting you in Department D." He went downstairs and spoke to Mrs. Brumley for a moment before he left. He explained that Miss Mallory had had the unwanted attentions of a man forced upon her for some time, and that was the reason for the hurry-up change of address. Mrs. Brumley was to see that she was disturbed by no strangers here, especially, and George described the large man carefully. The telephone cut into Pelgrim's sleep the next morning. One half-opened eye focused on the clock beside the receiver. He pulled the instrument from its cradle grouchily, noting that it was before 8. He made the noise that is a sleepy man's hello, and then her words cut into him deeper than the phone bell. It was Linda, and she was frightened, very frightened. George Pelgrim's eyes were open wide now. "Hey, wait a minute. Hold on." He checked her. "What was that again?" "It's in the paper," she repeated. "Peggy Green. She lived next door to me at the hotel. I've mentioned her to you, George. Well, maybe I haven't." "Well, what about?" "She's dead, I'm trying to tell you. They found her in the night." "That's tough," he sympathized. "Awfully tough. I know it's an awful shock, but I don't get—" "George, it's the same business, I'm sure. Listen to me. Peggy was almost my size. Yesterday, when I was packing up, she asked to borrow my blue suit. I loaned it to her. She wanted to wear it last night. Don't you see, George? She's blonde like me, too. He thought it was me." The reporter thought for a moment. "Get your breakfast there, and wait for me. I'll pick you up," he ordered, and hung up. 30 minutes later in a taxi, he read the early edition Gazette. The crime rated a 4-column headline. She'd been choked, police thought, sometime around midnight, in a lonely section not a dozen blocks from her hotel. It made George wonder if it was the same lonely section where he and Linda had had their experience earlier. The cause of death was strangulation. From marks on the throat, the victim had been killed by choking. No trace of the assailant, although police feel certain that it was a man. There was a picture of Peggy Green. She was blonde, older than Linda, and well-built and larger frame. In the dark, with her light hair and in the swimmer's dress, she could easily have been mistaken for the other girl. And she had been. There was the epitaph. Mrs. Brumley was bustling with solicitude, and poor child. Linda was holding back the tears with an effort. George tried patting her shoulder. It seemed inadequate. He finally persuaded the girl to come with him down to the Gazette office. "You don't want to sit around here all day, going over and over this thing." He pointed at the paper on the table. But they went over it going downtown. George forced an optimism he didn't feel. "We can give the cops a steer on this thing," he opinionated. He tried to avoid saying, "Obviously the big guy was after you," but Linda Mallory got it. She turned to him. "He's crazy, isn't he, George? Completely crazy. Some sort of strange, perverted maniac." "I don't know. I don't know what he is." No matter what is the trouble with the rest of the world, or with your own world, it helps to be in a big, impersonal office with a lot of people. You are caught up in the bustle and the activity. It is an intangible. It is esprit de corps, and the power of suggestion, and no matter what your trouble, you feel better. Linda did. 2 hours after she was introduced to Department D, she was sitting there doing routine typing, listening to the gum-chewing redhead on the left of her, complaining about her boyfriend and laughing despite herself at the wisecracks of one of the office boys who kept popping in. There was the other thing inside of her, the shock and the fear and the regret at losing a friend. Perhaps she hadn't known the green girl long. Maybe it was only a month or so, but still, the feeling was deeper within her now. George looked in 2 or 3 times that morning, noticed, and was pleased. He had their lunches sent upstairs, and afterward he took her around, showing her some of the printing presses and the composition rooms. Later that day, she called her swimming club. She told them, as George had instructed, simply that she had had to move, and that she'd come in within a week. They, in turn, passed on the information that there were a couple of letters for her, and a persistent caller, a man who kept asking about her whereabouts. "We've got him guessing." That evening, George saw her straight home in a cab. At the end of the week, she persuaded him to let her go to the swimming club. He got some mid-afternoon time off for both of them. "After all," she argued, "I'm supposed to be a swimmer. I have to practice once in a while." There was a pool in the basement of the building. Linda glanced at her mail, and then at George. He guessed what was coming. There was a leathery-faced, mannish-looking woman who had been fussing over her by the desk. He caught snatches like, "Neglecting your practice, my dear, and after such a promising beginning." Linda said, "George, I ought to do a little practicing in the pool. It's perfectly all right here. You can stay or go as you want. Isn't that okay?" "I'll stay," he replied curtly. The tank was in the basement level, a small 20-yard pool, green-sided, white-tiled bottom. There were a few benches running down one side. On the other were 2 corridors, one leading to the stairs from above, and the other leading to the dressing and shower rooms. He sat down on one of the benches and stretched his long frame. The water was very clear and completely quiescent. He supposed later in the afternoon and the evening other girls came here, but now it was very lonely, and the yellow dome lights blinked down solemnly on him. In a moment, Linda came out in her bathing suit. The leathery-faced woman who had been introduced to George as the association's swimming coach came and stood by the side of the pool and called down instructions as the girl swam up and down the tank, first slowly and then faster. "You're rolling a little too much, dear. That's it." George, less than the perfectionist than old Leatherface, marveled at Linda's powerful long strokes. "That's fine." The coach clapped her hands. "Now you do a few dozen pool lengths." The coach then beckoned to Pelgrim. "There's something I'd like to speak to you about," she said in a low voice. "Not here. Come up to my office a moment." George looked doubtfully back at Linda in the pool. She waved gaily to him. He followed the older woman up the stairs. She led him into a small, dingy office and closed the door. The walls were covered with photographs of girl swimmers. "My girls," old Leatherface intoned proudly. "And you know, I really think Linda Mallory could be one of the best. But she hasn't been practicing enough. Oh, no, not nearly enough." The woman fluttered on talking about Linda and swimming, and around the edges of several other subjects. Finally, the reporter asked, "And what was it you wanted to speak to me about?" The swimming coach reddened. Her hands waved in the air. Why, she's positively embarrassed, George realized. "I think I'd better be getting back to the pool." "No, no," she cried, and laid a claw-like hand on his arm. She tried for a smile and fluttered some more. "You see, Linda should devote her entire time to swimming. She could really, I think she could really become very good. It's a great opportunity," the woman went on. He agreed. "But I really think I ought to go back." She protested feebly again. The transparent stall of the thing suddenly hit Pelgrim. He yanked at the door and started down the stairs to the basement, 2 at a time. He heard the woman following some steps behind. The pool was empty, and its emptiness caught at his throat. He'd been upstairs how long? 10, 15 minutes? Maybe a little longer. He turned to old Leatheryface, raging. "Where's her room? Where's Linda Mallory's dressing room?" She beckoned down the other corridor. "It's really all right. Now, don't get so excited, young man." He pounded down the corridor. "That one." She indicated to the left. Everywhere else, the dressing-room doors were open, showing emptiness. Nothing but utter emptiness. Without knocking, he flung open the one closed door. It, too, was completely empty. The older woman stood in the door behind him outside. "Really, it's all right," she protested. "You're becoming much too excited." "What's all right?" George yelled. "She's with the gentleman," the coach insisted. "She's all right." The story poured out. This man who had phoned so often for Linda, and the time he'd come, admitting whimsically that as a suitor he was losing out to someone else. Would they let him know the next time she came? Phone him immediately. "He gave me his number," Leatherface proclaimed, "and positively forced a $50 bill on me." The memory of it still embarrassed her. He was very persistent. "What did he look like?" Pelgrim cried. "Well, not what you'd really call attractive. No, really not at all. He was very large, big, almost fat. Yes, fat. A large white face with very dark eyes. But he was very courteous to me." George could see her remembering the $50 bill. "And you think Linda left here with him of her own accord?" "Why, of course. He was her fiancé, sort of. At least that's what I gathered." That's what you gathered? George sneered, and he heard the strange sound of his own voice rising. Just look in here a minute. The woman came forward, peering into the chamber, eyes bulging as though she expected to find a corpse. Her clothes, Pelgrim thundered. Her dress, all her things are here. You think she vanished, left this building of her own accord just in a bathing suit? The woman shook her head, amazement spreading across her face. Certainly he wouldn't risk taking her upstairs and out front that way. Is there a back entrance? Quick! The woman nodded and beckoned out the way they'd come. George found it. The way led to an alley beside the building. It too was empty, but outside, lying beside the brick wall, was her bright red bathing cap. A rubber seam split at one place as though it had been torn off. He picked it up, and without another word to the startled older woman still dogging his trail, he got into a cab and told the driver, "Take me to the nearest police station." Sergeant Murphy was very helpful in that imperturbable, unconstructive way that police officials have in the face of any catastrophe. George gave a complete description of Linda, and, as best he could, a complete description of the big man. The only factor that caused the vestiges of life to light small fires for a moment in the sergeant's face was mention that the abductee was abducted in a bathing suit. In a bathing suit, you say now? That was Sergeant Murphy's sole contribution. George left for home. He poured himself a stiff drink and another. Then he remembered to phone the office and told them to transfer any calls to his apartment. George turned on the radio. He called the precinct. There was no news. He'd never before been a floor pacer, but now he paced. It was doubly hard, because it was his own fault for leaving her there. That stupid fool of a woman mouthing on about the gentleman giving her a $50 bill, not to know the name of the person he was seeking, except that $50 bills don't grow on trees, could mean he was rich, must mean he was well off. At 1:15 a.m. in the morning, George knew the time exactly because he just listened to the news on the radio. The knocking came at his door. The knocking was insistent, hysterical. Pelgrim opened the door, expecting anything. The anything was Linda. She fell into his arms. Her knees gave way and she sagged to the floor. There was an old, tattered long coat around her and an ugly bruise on her cheekbone. She mumbled something to him about a taxi driver downstairs, and she got out of the long coat. George got it. "Will you be all right for a minute?" She nodded, but sat there on the floor where she'd collapsed. Her face was grey, her eyes circled with fatigue. He made sure the catch was on the door and felt it lock from the outside. The cab driver was waiting skeptically and getting increasingly nervous. "Had not to do it, mister. Had not, accepting your wife is so pretty." He accepted his long coat back gratefully. George paid him the fare and a $5 tip, upon which the cabby grew loquacious. "Ought to take better care of your wife, mister. Beautiful girl like that. Masquerade party, she says to me. Some masquerade party, I says to myself, going around the city in a bathing suit. It's none of my business, but if you ask me, mister." George left the driver, still talking, and hurried back into the building. In a moment, he let himself back into his apartment. Her eyes were large with fear and glazed with shock. He pulled her over to his bed and hoisted her onto it. Then he called a doctor friend of his, a man who didn't mind being disturbed at this hour and wouldn't ask too many questions. Linda said little. She was plainly exhausted. Dr. Allen, when he came, confirmed that. "I've given her something to make her sleep." He punched his friend playfully on the shoulder. "What are you up to, George, my boy? And what's the swimming suit stunt? After mermaids now? She's all right. Pelgrim was in no mood for jokes. She's okay. A good sleep will do it. She's got a nasty bruise on her cheekbone there. I'd hate to see whatever she bumped into. After Alan had left, George tiptoed in and saw that Linda was sleeping. He shut the door quietly, and then curled up on the living room sofa. She slept late, and before he heard the first stirrings from her room, he'd already put together some breakfast and phoned the office saying she wouldn't be in, and he'd be late. When he took coffee and toast into her, he was pleased at how much better she looked, although the cheekbone was still ugly. She had a hearty, "Hi, what goes here?" for him. "You mean you don't remember?" He came back. She didn't shake her head, but she looked doubtful, just this side of shaking her head. Then she clenched her hands together tightly. "Yes." Her voice was low. "Yes, I do remember. I remember all of it, George. And I don't want to." He didn't like the look on her face, and he chatted quickly about something else and got some coffee into her. He told her to stay put, not to answer the door or even the telephone unless it rang in a simple code, he explained to her. Then he went out. The civil administration offices of the city were not unfamiliar to him. He'd been there before on stories. Once, there'd been a conference in the mayor's chambers. Another time, when the commissioner of police had been sworn in. The commissioner, George remembered, was a tall man with the erect carriage of the military and a bristly grey moustache, a rather fine-looking man. Waiting in the anteroom, George rehearsed in his mind what he was going to say. It was unusual, of course, to take a complaint to the commissioner, but he felt under the circumstances it was justifiable. He wasn't at all averse to cashing in on a public official's desire to please representatives of the press. A good press often elects public officials, and sympathetic reporting is a good press. Anybody, from the lowest ward heeler on up, knows this. He would state it simply. "Mr. Commissioner, I realize this is rather an extraordinary case, but this acquaintance of mine," and he would outline the situation, ending up with a description of the big man. The commissioner would listen politely, and at the very least there would be some sort of alarm or alert posted to pick up this character, at least for questioning. George waited, and then the door to the commissioner's office opened. The commissioner himself walked out, but George's eyes were not for his erect bearing and the neatly trimmed grey moustache. Instead, they were caught and fascinated by the commissioner's companion, the hugeness, the dark, rumpled suit. The two men shook hands fervently, and then the dark-suited monster lumbered past Pelgrim, as though he hadn't seen him, and out of the offices. The commissioner beckoned to the stunned reporter, frowning as he did so. The frown stayed put when they sat down inside. George's mouth was dry. His throat was tight. Words wouldn't come. Nothing came. Instead, the commissioner spoke from out of the frown. "Now, Mr. Pelgrim, you are Pelgrim of the Gazette, of course." George managed to nod. The commissioner went on. "Ah, yes, of course I remember you. Please don't tell me you've come here to make a complaint." George was immobile. The commissioner waved one hand. "We all make mistakes. Of course I don't want to embarrass you with a recital of what you know only too well, for the fact remains that Mr. Remsdorf, you just saw him leaving, has just made a complaint against you. He told me just now that, going by your conduct of the last few months, you would probably be following him here." The commissioner made another wave in the air with his hand. "He did say you might probably lodge a complaint against him." The commissioner smiled, as though this last contingency was so utterly ridiculous that no other facial reaction could satisfy it. "There's a girl I know," the commissioner continued. George started to speak, but the official motioned him to silence. I know how these misunderstandings come up. But I would suggest, under the circumstances, that you back out of this situation gracefully. I, of course, don't like to take any action on behalf of the city or the police department against you, or speak to your employer." "Who is he?" George finally got out. The commissioner looked surprised. "You don't know? That's Lothar Remsdorf, Jr." The name went around in Pelgrim's mind, and then the lights came on. Lothar Remsdorf Sr. had been the brilliant experimentalist and multimillionaire who owned the huge place up on Grandview Avenue, some plantations in the south, coal ore, timber, and vast real estate holdings. Remsdorf Jr. could buy and sell commissioners of police. "What does he charge me with?" George asked, tight-lipped. Now, Mr. Pelgrim. This can all be done with a minimum of dramatics, and without any great loss to yourself. There are, with what he meant to be a witty smile, other girls in the world. Just leave Mr. Remsdorf's fiancée alone. I make myself clear, I hope. The next few days were tortuous. Linda had regained her physical strength, and slowly the shock of her experiences with Remsdorf had passed. George learned about it bit by bit, not wanting to force her. How the big man had appeared from nowhere soon after George had gone upstairs with the swimming coach. He had grabbed her before she could escape into the pool again and forced her out the back way. They'd driven for a long time in his long, black, expensive limousine, chauffeured by some sort of liveried South American, she thought. He told her a strange tale about himself and about her, and where, like a crossword puzzle, their two destinies fitted together. He'd said, quite candidly, she recalled the story to Pelgrim, that he wasn't the same as other men. She'd listened to him with growing horror as he talked, not wanting to accept what he said, her eyes fascinatedly watching the drops of moisture on the backs of his huge, fleshy hands. And she remembered that when he touched her, his hands were wet as though he had been in swimming and not she. The prosaic, matter-of-fact way he presented what he averred was the scientific truth about himself made the revelations even more horrible. Linda had sat huddled in the corner of his huge sedan, stunned, speechless. Finally, he'd driven to the family townhouse on Grandview Avenue. He'd helped her inside. Helped was hardly the word, for his giant hand had closed over her forearm, and she sensed that he would have wrenched it out of the socket before he would have let her escape. And where could she go? The impossibility of fleeing down a city street in a bathing suit. He'd talked to her in the large house, as silent and imperturbable as its servants who came and went with drinks and food which she assiduously avoided touching. He drank, she noticed, huge quantities of liquids, beakers of milk, glasses and glasses of water, and assorted liquors. Finally, it was some time later that night. He'd sat dozing and looking waterlogged before her, surrounded by empty glasses. She'd gathered her strength and run off down the corridors of the old, monstrous house. She'd heard him come awake, the sound of a bell being rung, undoubtedly to summon the servants, and then his huge, flapping weight coming after her in pursuit. Thankfully, she'd found a door, and just as his nightmare shape rounded a corner behind her, she burst into the street, unmindful of her appearance. It was then she'd found a taxi, and brokenly told her story. It was any story, then, that she'd been at a masquerade, and given George's address. Pelgrim listened, half disbelieving some of the time, but the terror had been a valid thing stamped on her face, as real as the bruise where the big man had struck her when he dragged her struggling from the pool. The days became weeks, and the weeks, with their uneventfulness, gratefully lent themselves to a growing feeling of security. Linda sensed it and thrived on it. The colour came back into her pretty face. She'd continued on at Mrs. Brumley's, and their routine was simple. George picked her up every morning in a cab, and they went to the Gazette. They went home again together at night, and in all that time they never once saw Remsdorf. In the first few days of that period of time, George had found out what he could about Lothar Remsdorf Sr. and Jr. The father had been a brilliant scientist. No less an authority than Carroll had called him decades ahead of his time. He'd had the brilliant, analytical, incisive, and curious mind of the born experimentalist, plus the family hereditary of vast wealth, which allowed him to delve where he would, independent of the politics that surround the monetary grants from scientific and medical institutions. There were no limits, some experts felt, to the anthropological, biological, and protoplasmic advances Remsdorf might have been able to make when the catastrophic explosion destroyed his mountain laboratory. Most of his equipment and all of his notes were obliterated, and no trace of Remsdorf Sr. was ever found by searching parties who came to the lofty eyrie to search among the blackened ruins. There was a son, though, to carry on the name, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. Although his interests were not seemingly concerned with science, he had supposedly a brilliant mind, and his direct and only heir was one of the 3 wealthiest men in the country. A man in his position could purchase almost anything he wished, from property to human lives, to do with, to distort, or destroy, as he willed. Pelgrim felt a vast futility in those first few days, but as time passed and Linda grew more cheerful, he too had hopes that they had seen the last of the big man. With the months came early winter, and that past spring and summer seemed like some half-forgotten evil story laid in the distant past. Linda's work at the paper had gone on, but one day she came to George, her eyes bright. It was the Southern Indoor Swimming Meet, the last of the season. She wanted to compete. "I know I've neglected my practice," she admitted, "but I'd like to try. George, that awful business is behind us now. Don't you think it's all right?" He said he thought so, but somehow the association with swimming bothered him. He wangled the assignment from his editor, and a week later they were on the train, Linda's entry acceptance in her handbag. The trip to the southern city was an overnight hop. George saw Linda safely into her lower berth. Her upper was occupied by an elderly woman going to visit her son, while George had an upper across the aisle. His desire for a cigarette before turning in took the reporter to the rear of the train. The observation car was empty at this hour, except for a porter counting up tips. Pelgrim pushed open the door onto the observation platform and fumbled his way in the darkness to a seat. He cupped his hands over a match to light his cigarette. He inhaled deeply and then blew the smoke out into the currents of air that rushed past. It was quiet as a railroad car can be, with its rhythmical clicking of wheels, quiet enough so that when a voice said, "Good evening, Mr. Pelgrim," George jumped as though at a revolver shot. He turned his head and just made out the shape of someone sitting on the opposite rail of the platform. The tones and the shape were all too familiar. George let out air suddenly, and a gasp that sounded like, "You!" The revolver he'd gotten the license for several months ago was back inside, in his suitcase. "Please don't say anything as prosaic as that I'm following you," the big man chuckled. or I shall have to suggest to the authorities that quite the reverse is true. How is Miss Mallory?"
She was all right," George said angrily, rising to his feet. He stood at the entrance door, looking down at Lothar Remsdorf. "I don't care who you are. I'm going to get rid of you, do you understand?" But his heated denunciation only caused the big man to chuckle more.
"I mean to have her, Mr. Pelgrim, in spite of all your efforts. You see, she and I, our destinies are together to start a new race. But there I go. You wouldn't understand."
His voice took on a brittle hardness.
"She'll be mine, or she will not be at all. As for your worries about who I am, well, let that be subordinate, Mr. Pelgrim. I would suggest you worry about what I am."
George left the platform, raging at the sound of laughter behind him. He got into his berth and lay there the rest of the night, while the clicking wheels counted off the miles and the hours, and he thought and wondered and thought some more, always ending up at an impasse. The next morning he transferred the revolver from his suitcase into his pocket. He'd planned to say nothing about Lothar Remsdorf to Linda, but getting off the train, she spotted the big man alighting 2 cars down. The hugeness, the bulk, the dark, rumpled suit, these characteristics were not to be mistaken, nor were they lost on the girl. She lunged against Pelgrim. "Dear God," she almost cried. "Aren't we ever to be free of him? He's turned up again, George. What can we do?" He tried to quiet her, to soothe her. Their hotel was a small one, and George made sure there was no Remsdorf registered there. The next evening at the indoor championships, though, the big man was seated prominently in a front poolside seat. George wondered at Linda's courage. From his perch in the press row, he could see her strained face, her eyes drawn almost as though hypnotized to the dark bulk sitting, watching her implacably. In the finals, her start was poor, as though she were preoccupied with something else and hardly heard the gun. She swam courageously and splendidly, making up most of the lost ground. It was Remsdorf, and Remsdorf alone, that cost her first place. As it was, she came in second, a foot or so behind the leader. Later, in her hotel, the girl came close to hysteria. The medal presentations were scheduled for the next day. "We've got to get out of here, George," Linda insisted. "I'm so terribly afraid of him." He agreed. They packed hurriedly and left by a back way. The small southern town was filled with visitors attracted by the aquatic show. In spite of the chill air, a carnival spirit pervaded the streets. George found a cab and pushed Linda inside, directing the driver to the station. The first time he turned around and looked out the back window, there was nothing suspicious. The second time, he thought they were being followed. When they pulled into the railroad terminal, he was sure. He threw a bill at the driver, grabbed their luggage, and hustled the girl into the waiting room. A last glance had showed another cab trundling down the street towards the station. The ticket agent blinked at him sleepily. "Now, don't be so excited, young man. The next express for the north doesn't come through here for better than 2 hours yet. Can't understand why you Yankees are so goddarn anxious to get back up to that blighted country." The other cab had stopped in the driveway. George pushed Linda out the door that led to the platform. The tracks gleamed coldly under the occasional electric bulbs. They hurried up the platform away, and then Pelgrim, looking back, saw the oblong of light when the station door opened. Still, they couldn't be seen by someone coming out of the lighted waiting room. "We'll cut across the tracks," he muttered. "It's the only way." It was flight now. Blind, hysterical flight to get away. Months long the pursuit had lasted, its tempo increasing. He helped Linda as her heels caught in the ballast underneath the ties. 4 tracks, 8 rails they stumbled across, and then there were bushes and shrubs, thankfully on the other side. "You know where we're going?" she asked. "I'm not sure, but I remember when we came here there was an airfield not far from the station." They pushed on through the wooded area, almost at the same time that they saw the circular beacon in the sky ahead of them. They both detected the sounds of pursuit, heavy, methodical tramping, unmistakably the sounds of a big person following them. "Go on," George panted to Linda, and the scene was faintly reminiscent of that other time, months earlier in the city. "Go on. You can make it. I'll follow." He wanted to keep both bags, but she insisted on taking one. She was gone then into the darkness. Her lips brushed his cheek. She murmured, "I don't want to leave you." And he ordered her roughly away. "I'm running this for better or worse." She saw the revolver in his hand, and she understood. The minutes passed, more time than he dared to hope for. She was well away by now, nearly to the municipal airport, he thought. And then out of the shrubbery loomed Lothar Remsdorf, the clothes on his huge bull-like body more rumpled than ever, hands hanging at his sides, his black hat clamped tight on his head. He came forward slowly, and what light there was reflected from the stars and the sky glanced off the dull barrel of Pelgrim's revolver. "Now will you leave us alone?" the reporter snarled between clenched teeth. "Will you go back the way you've come and never bother us again?" The laughter started then inside the big man, deep inside, and it grew to a gurgling sound to hear. The giant hands were raised, and the first menacing step forward was taken, when George fired. He was aiming squarely at the gigantic middle, and at the range of only several paces he couldn't have missed. Remsdorf lurched on towards him, and the slobbering sound of his laughter seemed to beat down on the reporter. George fired again and again, but the monster kept coming. 2 more shots, and then with 1 chamber left, Pelgrim raised his revolver, pointed it squarely at the hideous white, swollen face looming before him. He pulled the trigger and saw the course of the bullet in the man's face. Remsdorf shook his head then and stopped, but Pelgrim was as though rooted to the spot, fascinated. The big man was still grinning, and 1 hand came up and touched cheek. The hole there was apparent, but what was oozing out, slowly, thickly, almost like honey, was not blood. It could not be blood, for it was not red. It was a neutral-colored liquid, strange and terrible to see, as it was inexplainable. An almost whitish, thick, serum-like substance. "You've water in you, not blood," the reporter screamed involuntarily. You're not human." Almost imperceptibly, the gigantic head nodded, as though in mute, mirthful agreement. George turned and ran then, ran as fast as he could, as long as he could. There was somewhere in the back of his consciousness, the youngster thought, that this could not be, and that he would wake up and find it was dream stuff. But he had enough presence of mind to shove the empty revolver in his coat pocket as he came onto the municipal airport field. She was beckoning to him, and they got on a flight to the north. He couldn't speak for gasping, but they sat huddled together while the plane filled. The minutes ticked away, and Linda kept murmuring, her head against his shoulder, "Why didn't they leave? Why didn't they leave?" He held her head there because he was too tired to do anything else, and because he didn't want her to see who had just gotten into the plane, their plane, grinning still. A man with 6 bullets in him. A man? They flew into the night, and into the dawn, and all the time George could feel, without looking, those eyes on them from the rear. Linda slept against his shoulder fitfully, and he brushed her golden hair gently over her eyes. The flight ended at a northern airport, and the two disembarked groggily with little fight left in them. Remsdorf was close behind. It was one of those vagaries of fate that made George look towards the Canadian plane warming up in the next runway. On the spur of the moment he bought 2 tickets, and in 15 minutes they were flying north again, but no more alone, no more unpursued than they had been before. George had a relative in this certain Canadian town towards which they headed, an uncle of some influence locally, but who could not be expected to contribute to their problem concretely. It was only the impulse to keep going that had driven Pelgrim on. Linda was too cold and too tired to care any longer. It was beginning to snow when they landed in the northern Canadian airport. George got Linda into a hack. The faithful Remsdorf was close behind in another. They got out at his uncle's address, leaning together for support. The snow was heavier, and the wind was freezing. George looked for his uncle's name on the doorbells. There was nothing. Frantically, he pushed Superintendent. Remsdorf's trailing cab stopped outside, and the big man got out across the street. George hoped he froze in his rumpled dark suit, got sick, dropped dead, anything. The superintendent shoved a bleary face around the door jamb. "He's not here anymore. He's moved. He's 10 blocks or so up the street." He scribbled an address for Pelgrim and handed it to him. The two started out again, heads bent against the storm. The snow had all but stopped as the mercury tumbled even lower, but the going was bad and the wind ferocious. Linda's teeth chattered as they trudged on, endlessly it seemed. The final half of the way led through a small park, deserted in this weather. The big man was still behind them, George saw when he craned his head, but there was something newly strange. "What is it?" Linda's fingers dug into Pelgrim's arm. "It's all right," George reassured. "Let's just keep going." But his head was still craned backward. The big man was walking staggeringly, stiffly. He seemed to be trying as hard as before to keep up with them, but his steps were clumsy even for him. They had almost reached the other side of the park when George saw Remsdorf stagger and put his great hands out to clutch at a bench. He eased himself stiffly into it, like a very old man with rheumatism. George turned his head away, and there was the address ahead. Soon they were inside, out of the bitter weather, and his uncle, small, grey as ever, was clucking over them like a mother hen. Linda was put to bed immediately in the guest room, with a hot water bottle and a pint of spiked hot tea. George talked with his uncle for a while, grateful that the older man didn't press him for reasons. "I know you newspaper fellows," his relative wagged. "Always up to some kind of scalawag, looking for stories. Son, you ought to turn in now. You look pretty tuckered." George assured him he would, but said no. Certainly he wouldn't take the older man's bed. He'd sleep outside here. By midnight, the house was quiet. George tiptoed to the front closet and took out a greatcoat. Then, as silently, he let himself out the front door. The night was bright with snow and clear with the 0 temperature.
He made his way into the barren and deserted park. He walked down the path they'd taken earlier, until he came to the desolate bench set by the way. There was Remsdorf, no longer grinning, sitting fixedly. The reporter's thoughts went back to the water substance that had flowed from the monster's wound, where red blood should have been. George came closer, and his eyes bulged. It was too much. It was incredible. But Remsdorf's head under the black slouch hat seemed a snowball. His hands were stiff claws of ice. Disbelieving, George took the revolver from his pocket, and with its barrel struck gently against one of the outstretched fingers. The tip broke off as easily as if this thing were a candy figure. For Remsdorf was not of this world. He was frozen. He was dead. He was an Iceman, and no more. The Damp Man Returns by Allison V. Harding. 1. To make a name for himself on a metropolitan paper, a reporter must have A. a terrific story, B. a terrific exclusive story, and C. a terrific exclusive story that his city editor will print. George Pelgrim mused on this as he sat in the Green Eaves Bar and Grill. He'd rung the bell on the first two requirements, but his editor on the Gazette, there was a tough baby. Pelgrim glanced at his wristwatch. In half an hour, he was meeting Linda. He took for the umpteenth time that day the Canadian postmarked envelope out of his pocket and looked at the letter from his uncle. As he read over again the penned words, headlines formed in his mind, and a first-page #1 column story materialized. The Damp Man would be the identifying lead, and the story was as strange or stranger than any readers were likely to come across in our time. Pelgrim remembered the last time he'd seen the Damp Man, whose uncommon fixation on blonde and beautiful Linda Mallory was strange only because of its fanaticism and degree. He remembered the nightmarish quality of those moments in a northern Canadian town, where the giant lumbering creature had pursued them through a park on a night so cold that the very air, as he and Linda sucked it in, seemed to be a congealed thing. And he recalled how the Damp Man was gaining, and then suddenly lagged and stopped, sat down on a bench as though a man grown weary of the pace. With Linda safely away, George had come back through the still night, the only movement being the white plume of air as he exhaled. He could have sworn the Damp Man was a frozen thing now, and he remembered turning away from the rigid figure without conscience. It was fortunate that his uncle was a trustee of the hospital up there, and through him the strange reports filtered out. The reports were appalling, but they were true, if science is any yardstick of truth, and to George it meant the greatest story of his career. However, the reluctance of the Canadian press to issue one line of intelligence on the matter was matched by his own city editor down here on the Gazette. The whole episode was covered in a small item, stating merely that the multimillionaire Remsdorf Jr. was confined to a hospital in a small Canadian town, where he'd been visiting when taken ill. Lothar Remsdorf Jr. was the son and sole heir of the brilliant scientist who'd been destroyed in the mysterious explosion of his laboratory fully 2 decades ago. No trace of his body or unique scientific data had ever been found. "You're out of your mind,"
City editor McBrien had flayed at Pelgrim when George had hinted at the immensity of the story at hand. "Those interests," meaning Remsdorf, "are big enough to buy this sheet, big enough to buy you and me in this whole town, most of the country, too." McBrien went on to say the paper's publisher and owner would never stand for such a thing. This was one of the frustrations of the newspaper business, the "you can't print that" barrier. George wondered, though, if these things that his uncle discreetly reported to him in special delivery letters didn't sneak out even with scientists' ethics being what they are. For Lothar Remsdorf, the scion and offspring of millions, was no ordinary man. He was something else, impossible perhaps for even a scientific mind, much less the laity, to evaluate. Yet it had started simply enough. The removal of a man apparently completely frozen to the Canadian town's hospital morgue. In the morgue, this man had come to life again, but that can happen. Doctors have pronounced the undead dead before, and will again. It was the tests that told the strangest tale. For when Lothar Remsdorf was recuperating in the Northern Hospital, the routine yardsticks were applied to him as they are to all patients. It was then, so the secretly dispatched reports from his uncle revealed, that some astonishing discoveries were made. Lothar Remsdorf's veins, for instance, were not filled with blood, but with some subhemolytic fluid not far removed from the substances in a jellyfish. The average human, scientists know, is made up 2/3 of water. The damp man was 95% water. His organic functions, as they revealed their secrets one by one to the tests that were applied, were sluggish, slow-functioning machines beyond any conceivable range of normalcy or abnormalcy. His uncle, Pelgrim noticed, more than once commented on reports from the hospital that Remsdorf consumed fantastically extravagant quantities of fluids. Consequently, he required very little in the way of solid food. George put the envelope back in his pocket. He paid his check and walked out into the spring sunlight. It was Saturday, and Linda, when he met her at the drugstore corner, had on a Saturday dress and a bright smile to match. With the dreadful and unwanted affections of Lothar Remsdorf removed, she was again her age of the early 20s. They talked little of the times when he'd first met her. She still did some competitive swimming. That was one of the things which had drawn Remsdorf to her initially, that she should start with him a new race of beings based on her physical aquatic abilities and his physiological affinity for water. They had a nice Saturday afternoon, George and Linda. They walked in the park like so many other couples that afternoon, his arm around her supple waist. Regretfully, he took her back to her boarding house early after supper. He was working on a Sunday feature about the disappearing trolley car, and deadline was approaching. It was 9 p.m. when he unlatched his apartment door and saw the yellow oblong of a telegram lying on the floor. The message was from his uncle. It was terse and to the point. It had been sent that morning. Remsdorf escaped hospital during night. Whereabouts, unknown. His uncle's use of the word escaped meant to George that Remsdorf was not supposed to be by any means through with his official hospital visit, in the opinion of hospital authorities. George sat down in a chair by the window and tried to think. He discarded the idea of calling Linda up and warning her. After all, Remsdorf supposedly did not know the girl's address. He wondered, as he had before, at Remsdorf's persistence. Originally, it had been none of his affair. Beyond his affection for Linda, there was no reason why he should risk his job and his life battling someone so entirely monstrous and determined as Lothar Remsdorf. And yet he knew he would continue to battle him until one or the other of them would be done forever, if only for Linda's sake. Public officials are fearful of highly placed pressure, George knew, and dependent as they are for their livelihoods on votes and patronage, They are sometimes easier to handle than private citizens. If this whole grisly thing could be forced into the spotlight, and why couldn't it? He'd had trouble pleading his case with McBrien, but what about the publisher of the Gazette? He was the man to see. Not a small, wizened, penny-cautious milquetoast like Pelgrim's city editor. Instead, he would see the Gazette's owner, and see him soon if it were humanly possible. It was a tossing and turning night for George. He heard the city sounds gradually put themselves to sleep, until finally there was nothing to keep his troubled mind occupied but the square of light on the ceiling, reflected from the street lamp outside and below. He'd seen his publisher only once before. The occasion was when he'd been a cub, and it concerned the legal aspects of his report on a jumped-or-fell story. Publisher Toller was a flint-eyed man, with a raspy voice and a huge chart of circulation hanging behind his chair. You stood in his presence and you spoke only when spoken to. In the small hours of the morning, Pelgrim got up and drew himself a glass of water. On his way back to bed, he paused for a moment beside the window and looked out. The street was deserted, except that lounging against the base of a lamp-post across the way was a man. He was small, nondescript, but his eyes were turned upward toward George's floor and his own window. The reporter went back to bed, frowning. The next day, George made his desire known to city editor McBrien. The other raised his eyebrows. "If you've got any bright ideas about how you're worth more to this paper, I'm the man to see, and the answer is no." George hastily assured him he was not interested in seeing Mr. Toller to ask for a raise. McBrien ferreted around and grumbled when George refused to give his reason. "Either you get the appointment from me or I'll do it through his office direct," was Pelgrim's ultimatum. The city editor mumbled something about ungrateful young pups. A few days later, the reporter received word from the publisher's office that he'd been granted a 15-minute appointment in 2 weeks. Pelgrim cursed at the delay, but the tone of the note allowed no argument. Since the night he'd noticed the little man standing outside his apartment building, George had had the ever-increasing feeling that he was being followed. In the days when Remsdorf himself had lumbered after him and Linda, there had been no question. Now his pursuer was a shadow that came and went, something to be seen out of the corner of one's eye, so lacking in substance that not once again had George been able to get a true picture of a face or form. If he walked at night down a long street, though, there were always footsteps or a figure somewhere back of him in the gloom. If he taxied, there was another cab behind. It was because of this George had avoided going to Mrs. Brumley's to see Linda. This enforced separation from her made him unhappy. Their conversations made him unhappy. "Hello, Linda, dear." "Hi, George." "I'm not coming up, and you'd better stick close there." He tried to hide the news about Remsdorf, but he suspected that she guessed. Several times he pleaded with her. "Why not get out of town? You're in the clear. You've got those relatives in the West." But she wouldn't, and when he asked her the reason, she said, "Well, never mind." But he thought he knew, and it pleased him because he certainly felt the same way too. He finally told her that he thought he was being tailed. No, not by Remsdorf, he hastened to add. Did she miss him? Sure did. It was pretty tough just sitting around up there, wasn't it? Well, she read a lot, but couldn't she see him? Meet him somewhere? No, not now. "I'm doing what I think is right," he always ended their phone conversations with, and she replied yes, she knew it, and believed in him. Then they always said small, tender things to each other at the end, just before he hung up. She to go back into her vacuum of loneliness, her virtual exile at Mrs. Brumley's, and he to match steps and shadows with his pursuers. Although his work hadn't suffered noticeably, George had been in the office little the last week or so. McBrien grumbled, and one or two of his fellow workers joked about it. There were things happening upstairs, the rumor was. It was a good time for a guy to be very much seen and on the job. George shrugged, paying little attention. After all, it was tomorrow he was seeing the publisher. 2. 11 a.m., the memo from the office had said, and George was sitting in the elaborate anteroom at 10 to 11. He remembered his old-time shyness with Mr. Toller with some contempt. That was the anxiety of extreme youthfulness, he reasoned. This time he'd talk out from the shoulder. He'd say, "Mr. Toller, I have the biggest story of this sheet's history. You may think it's a daring thing to print, and there are a lot of reasons why it can't be printed, but there are more reasons why it must be." At precisely 11, a buzzer rang on the receptionist's desk, and she beckoned to him. "You may go in now." He opened the door and went inside, shutting it behind him. The room was good-sized and looked as if it belonged in a private home rather than an office building. It was book-lined. There were wall-length drapes hanging beside the windows. Mr. Toller was standing in the center of the room. George had never seen him standing before. He looked tall and thinner than Pelgrim had remembered. Toller was speaking. "Understand from Mr. McBrien you have something of the greatest importance to say to me. Under the circumstances, felt that you should. The new publisher." A wave of the hand. "He thought by all means that you should be heard." George's head spun, and he found himself unable to look away from that grinning face sitting behind the publisher's desk. The desk that used to be Toller's, but was no more. From a fantastic distance, Toller's voice droned on. "The new publisher, Lothar Remsdorf. Mr. Remsdorf, this is one of our best reporters, George Pelgrim." Sitting there behind the publisher's desk, his mountain of flesh oozing over the arms of a mahogany chair, his pudgy hands clasped before him on the mahogany, staring unblinkingly at Pelgrim, grinning. Stories flooded through George's mind, bits of office gossip. The newspaper was Toller's life and blood. Family tradition and all that meant more to him than his own life. And now this tall, austere, spare man was acting deferential. He was nobody anymore, no publisher, no business, just a man standing there in the center of the floor. Remsdorf waved his hand.
"Thank you, Mr. Toller. Thank you. Now I'm not going to trouble you to stay here with us any longer. I shall listen to Mr. Pelgrim's important, thought myself."
Toller bowed his head servilely and walked from the room. So the gossip George had heard murmured downstairs for the past few days was true. A change in management.
"Yes, I'm the new owner of this newspaper,"
boomed Remsdorf.
"I hope you're going to enjoy working for me, Pelgrim."
There was silence between the two for a moment, and then the big man asked,
"Where is she?"
The relief must have showed on the reporter's face, for Remsdorf's frown was sudden and terrible.
"I'll find her," he gritted. "Early or late, but find her I will. She's to be mine. You understand, Pelgrim?"
There was a strange, unwholesome light that glittered for a moment beyond the black opacity of the fat man's eyes.
"Where is Linda Mallory?" the giant repeated. "I'll make a deal with you, George Pelgrim. I want her, and quickly. I know you know where she is, and I think you know that I shall eventually find her, but perhaps you can save me time and trouble. Even an hour saved in my quest is worth anything."
The big, doughy hands clenched and unclenched. He continued, softly.
"I know men's minds, Pelgrim. I know that you believe yourself to be in love with this girl, and in all probability she with you, but I assure you that it is not written in destiny that you two shall belong to each other. I've told you that that girl is entirely necessary to me. A pretty face, a pretty figure, Pelgrim. You can find those anywhere. Thousands, millions of them. You're young. There'll be other girls. Dozens of them. Linda Mallory is a necessary part of something that an average human such as yourself could not understand. But contemplate, if you can, Pelgrim, with your everyday mind, the implications involved. You know, I think, that I am not quite like other men. My life force is in different balance. It is probably no secret from you that I quite baffled the medicos in a certain Canadian hospital by the fact that through my veins, instead of blood, courses what 3 learned men described as a water-like serum. My organs and their functions confounded them, and their pathetic instruments. The fat man's body quivered and shook with inner mirth. He raised his hand from the desk where it had been lying, and George's eyes were fascinated by the small pool of moisture that was revealed. Linda has certain abilities that will complement my own. She is the other part of my plan to rear a new race on this earth. Playfully, the May wind tugged at the drapes behind the publisher's chair. George stood like a statue, as though in a trance. This monster man exerted a strange, overpowering influence. The reporter noted the beads of moisture on Remsdorf's flaccid face, and as he watched, Pelgrim felt a knot of nausea tighten in his stomach. This preposterous creature before him, this absurd, macabre, wholly terrifying blob of protoplasmic monstrousness. He watched fascinatedly as a drop of water fell from a pudgy forefinger. How appropriate was the appellation he'd pictured for his newspaper story, the Damp Man. The other watched him closely. "I think I amaze you, George Pelgrim," he rumbled. "But have you ever thought that a race of such as me would be nigh invincible? You know that I am all but indestructible." His laugh was a wet rumble inside that cavernous body. "Be reasonable. Here is my offer. Surely you know." He waved an arm to include the room and the whole building. "I have no interest in the newspaper business, but it amused me to buy Toller out. It means so much to him. And yet, as we philosophers say, every man has his price, eh? Now, Pelgrim, I will make you editor of this paper. I will make you publisher of this paper, if you wish, and step aside myself. Plus," he flapped his hand in the air, "the payment to you of any reasonable sum, I say, which you may want. In return, bring Linda Mallory to me." "How do you know I can?" the reporter spoke. "I have great confidence in your abilities," answered Remsdorf. "My guess and belief is that she's in this city, although so far my agents have failed to locate her." "You're responsible for having me followed?" "Oh, yes," admitted Remsdorf. "Yes, I've got you under night and day surveillance, Pelgrim. Think over my offer. Make this decision the right way, and you'll be set for life. And, as I said before, there are so many other girls in the world." George cleared his throat. "I don't need to do any thinking. The answer is no." "I don't need to remind you that I'm now your employer," said the other man sibilantly. "I can fire you, Pelgrim, at a moment's notice, and I can fix it so that you get no other job in this town." He leaned forward ominously, his great shoulders hunched. "Or just about anywhere else. Think the whole thing over, and there are worse things I can do." "Oh, incidentally, what was the idea you came up here to talk to Toller and me about?" George smiled bitterly. "Skip it. I don't think it would appeal to the new management."
Pelgrim left and went downstairs. He passed McBrien's desk on the way to his own, and the city editor leered at him suspiciously. George sat for a while, tinkering with his typewriter, staring off into space blankly. There was a macabre awfulness about the thought of that fat octopus sitting upstairs. Toller, whatever his unpopularity, had been a newspaperman through and through. Remsdorf had bought him out for only one reason, just a pawn, just another step in his attack against Pelgrim and toward Linda Mallory. One thing was very sure. He couldn't see the girl now under any circumstances. He must even be careful about phone calls made to her. He wondered if Remsdorf had enough official pull to have a tap placed on his apartment phone. That night, he called her from a pay booth and watched to see that the sallow little man dogging his trail was not near enough to decipher the clicking as he dialed Mrs. Brumley's. He told Linda tersely what had happened, and he pleaded with her again to leave town. She cried a little over the phone and said no, she wouldn't leave, but she had to see him. They argued a nickel's worth, and George felt the frightening hopelessness of trying to persuade her. To quiet the girl, he promised that he would try to get up there sometime that night. He hung up and brushed past the slouched figure of the trailer in the drugstore door. The man hunched his shoulders and followed in pursuit. George took a bus across town, but the little man followed him. He took a cab, switched cabs in midtown traffic. His pursuer was similarly agile. He disappeared down a subway and tried to time his charge into an express. The little swarthy man squeezed through the doors too, though. They sat inside, the little man indifferent, while George glowered at him. They reached the end of the line, and George slipped into a movie house. Back of him, he heard the sound of someone else fumbling to a seat. The theater was sparsely populated, and after a little while George got up and started back up the aisle. He saw no one until he got into the lobby, but then, his heart leaping with hope that he'd shaken the swarthy man somehow, slowed with discouragement. The little fellow was making a phone call in a booth, all the while his eyes fixed on the aisle mouths. George darted sideways, and the phone booth door slammed open. He ran up steps to the mezzanine level, hearing the soft pad of feet behind him. There was a red sign saying restrooms. He ducked for it. The room was tiled, dingy, and Pelgrim wrinkled his nose distastefully. But there was one break. It was completely empty, except for himself. He slid behind the door and waited. For a moment nothing happened, and George matched mental acrobatics with the one who trailed him. The other man's first instinct, of course, was to wait outside. But then almost immediately would come the suspicion that possibly there might be another way, if only a window opening onto a court, or an escape. The metal door swiveled inward. George waited only to recognize his man, and then he swung hard. The vicious blow caught the little man under one ear and crashed him to the tiled floor. George bent over, his fists ready, but there was no further need. The guy was out cold. Pelgrim whipped out the door and down the steps. He went out front and hailed the first cab he saw. He gave Mrs. Brumley's address and settled back on the cushions, massaging his bruised knuckles. They were halfway there when habit caused him to turn around and peer out the window. Out of the sea of traffic behind, there was one cab that stuck with them, turning when they turned, accelerating and slowing when they did. George's heart sank. He countermanded his first order to the cabby and gave his own address. The little man evidently had another little man following him. He might have known that Remsdorf's resourcefulness would foresee the ambushing of one agent. He got out at his address and saw the other cab stop up the block and expel a single passenger. It gave him some satisfaction to note that this man was medium-sized and heavy. He hoped fervently that the other fellow would be nursing a bad neck and jaw for several days. George hesitated a moment, undecided whether to go upstairs and make his call or not. Then he tramped into the corner delicatessen. He got Linda and told her exactly what had happened. "I'm sorry I can't come," he said tiredly. "You're all right as long as I stay away from you. But I guess that's the way it'll have to be until we think up something else." The hurt in her voice was something he couldn't bear. He knew she was on edge and nervous. So was he. He cut her short and hung up. There was no use of the two of them beating at each other. He tumbled into bed exhausted and slept. His sleep was a black and orange and purple thing, first color and then noise. The noise was sharp and insistent. It poked and prodded him until the sleep was gone sufficiently for him to recognize the sound. It was his doorbell. He shoveled his feet into slippers, reached for the heavy piece of lead pipe he kept by his bed now, and scuffed into the hall. He opened the door. It was Linda. Even while he kissed her and felt the warm moisture of her tears on his cheek, he was thinking, "Good God, this has done it." She clung to him and talked on the way a woman does about not caring about anything else but being with him. All the time he was trying to think. She knew less than he did about this hulking abnormal who coveted her being and soul, and certainly this was no place for her. This settled it. They could have only a few moments. Thank the Lord he had some money here. "You sit down," he ordered. "I'm going to get dressed. We're leaving town tonight." He frenziedly piled a few essentials into a bag, threw his clothes on in the bathroom, and came back. She looked almost pleased sitting there in the chair. Her face lit up when she looked at him, in a way that made him happy. "You did a terrible thing," he reproached, and then was sorry he'd said it. "I know," she replied simply. He was not surprised at Remsdorf or any man becoming obsessed with this blonde girl. Her tall, well-formed beauty was breathtaking. He wrenched his thoughts back to their problem. "Now listen, we're leaving. We're going to get to a station and get on a train and go out to your relatives. We'll get married as soon as we can. I know this is a hell of a way to propose to you, but this is a hell of a situation we're in." She squeezed his hand. She was going to say something, but the sound of squealing brakes drew his attention to the window. He stood there and looked down. There were two men standing in front of the house, and a cab had just drawn up. The cab door opened, and out of the black interior stepped Lothar Remsdorf. The three men talked a moment. They looked upstairs at his window, and then they walked towards the apartment house front, out of Pelgrim's sight. A second later, the house phone jangled. "What's the matter, George?" He turned away from the window. "It's our pudgy friend," he hastily explained to Linda. "Now look, we've got to go down the back way. Maybe they don't know about that yet. It's a chance. All set?" "All set." He showed her the back door. "Open it and stand by it. I'll be right back." The house phone was still jangling. George picked it up. "Hello?" Remsdorf's voice came to him.
"Pelgrim, I know you have some interesting company up there. I'd like to join you."
"Are you crazy? There's no one up here. And what the hell's the idea of waking me up at this hour?"
"I shall remind you that I am your employer."
The damp man's laughing gurgle came over the wire.
"Invitation or not, Pelgrim, we're coming up."
"Come on," bellowed the reporter. "Come up and see what a fool you've made of yourself." He slammed the receiver down and sprinted for the back stairs. Linda was with him, and they thundered down. On the first floor, the escape emptied into an alley. There was no one at the outside door. He pulled the girl along until they came to the alley mouth. Nothing in the street but the cab Remsdorf had come in, parked in front of the building. The two ran for it. He jumped in the back. "Hey, this is taken, mister." The hackster swiveled his neck. George waved a $10 bill. "Taken be damned. We're in a hurry to catch a train. Sick mother. Let's go." The cab ground into first gear and started off. They barely pulled away from under the streetlight when a yell went up from behind. They'd been spotted. "You're going to get me in trouble, mister," the driver protested. They turned 2 more corners, and then George ordered the car stopped. "We've changed our mind. Go back and pick up those guys if you want." He pulled Linda out. The perplexed driver started back the way he'd come. "We'll do better on foot. Get a subway 3 blocks up here near the park. That'll take us right to the station. Come on. Hurry." Behind them, an auto backfired, and a motor roared as they sprinted for the square of light heralding the subway stairs. They had crossed the last street, made the final curb, when Linda's hand wrenched out of his own. He turned desperately and lunged for her falling body, but clutched instead only a flimsy edge of dress. She fell heavily on the cement. He dropped the bag and bent down, ready to lift her up. "Darn it," she gritted through pain-whitened lips. "My ankle! On a stone." He helped her up, but she could hardly stand. She hobbled painfully. Back of them, 3 blocks away, a car came into view. "Quick," he said. The subway entrance was still 100 yards away, but the wall separating them from the park was here. He boosted her onto its top and vaulted up after her, the suitcase forgotten now on the sidewalk. They fell into the underbrush on the other side. He put his arm around her waist, and they made as much time as they could in the darkness and through the bushes. Behind them, they heard the squeal of auto brakes. He strained his ears over the noise of their own progress, and finally, the sounds that he feared came to him. The crash and crackle told him that their pursuers had spotted the suitcase and the place along the wall where they'd fled into the park. The ground was uneven. It was rocky in spots. Elsewhere the earth was soft. He could tell from the occasional swift intakes of breath that Linda was in pain with her ankle, but he had to hurry her on, helping her as much as he could with one arm around her waist. George had little or no idea where they were headed, but it mattered not at all, as long as they kept ahead of the gigantic and sinister Remsdorf and his 2 little agents. Finally, as though by mutual consent, they stopped, and George looked around them in a circle. On all sides, but far away, for they must now be nearly in the center of the park, he calculated, were the clustered pinpoint lights of the city. When for a second the reporter heard none but night sounds in the park around them over the thunder of his beating heart, he thought with a wild surging hope that they had eluded the 3. But then there was the crackle of a twig, and a bush shook itself off somewhere behind them. He knew they had to go on. Linda gasped when he suggested they start again. She bent over and rubbed her injured ankle. "How is it?" She didn't answer. He kneeled down and touched the limb himself. Her ankle was already badly swollen. The sounds of pursuit were louder, and through the trees he caught the faint but unmistakable wink of a flashlight coming towards them. Instinctively, the 2 turned and staggered forward. He realized now that after yesterday's rain, their progress was easy to follow for anyone with a lamp. Linda saw it first and pulled at his arm. Set in the side of a nearby hill was the open maw of a tunnel. He recalled that there had been a reservoir here, and this was one of the channels that had carried pipes to the pumping and purifying galleries. They reeled toward it and went inside. The ground was damp, and the air unwholesome in the tunnel, and as they walked, they bumped occasionally against the dripping walls. They trudged to the farthest end. Here the pipes ran upward, and there were rude steps leading to an inspection ledge some 15 or 20 feet above the tunnel level. Somehow they staggered up on the ledge and sank to its damp floor. George held Linda's head in his lap. She was shaking with the excitement of the ordeal and the pain of her badly injured leg. Then an arm of light quickly streaked along the tube for a minute, and they knew the 3 pursuers were already in the tunnel. By lying flat and against the wall, they could not be seen from below. Pelgrim put his fingers over Linda's lips, and they waited. Remsdorf and his two assailants were below their ledge talking, shining the flashlight around. Then the voices stopped, and the flashlight beam became fixed. The narrow steps had been discovered. Pelgrim knew it was Remsdorf coming up after them when he heard the first heavy, shuffling tread. The light grew brighter as the reporter gathered himself to spring. It followed the curve of the steps, and that was the one thing George counted on. It would be directed naturally at the first area to present itself to the eye, rather than searching inward towards the extreme corner near the wall where the two fugitives crouched. Remsdorf cleared the last step and stood, as George had predicted to himself, near the outer ledge, shining his torch directly forward. At that precise moment, Pelgrim leaped. He hit the fat man before there was a chance to even look or swivel the light inward. He drove with his shoulder and his arms, and great though the weight was of the damp man, he staggered under the assault and teetered on the ledge's rim. George made a last lunge, and a great wet hand flayed at him, just missed a hold on his coat. His opponent toppled off the ledge then, and George himself reeled. It was Linda's capable hands at his own shoulder that steadied him. Below, there was the crashing impact of Remsdorf landing on the tunnel floor. A curious, strange noise it was, almost a wet, splashing sound. The flashlight was also a victim of the fall, and then the first excited chatter of Remsdorf's two companions died away. There was complete silence. Pelgrim had no idea how long he and Linda Mallory sat huddled together on the ledge. Whatever its length, it was a pathetically cruel period of time, for it was a hopeful, almost glad space, only to be shattered by the first of those unmistakable footsteps on the stairs below, a sound that the mind tried to reject. Because how could a man fall better than 20 feet to a rock-bedded tunnel floor, and yet, those shuffling, approaching steps were unmistakable. And there were other sounds. Remsdorf was coming back this time in force. George crouched on all fours in the darkness, pushing Linda behind him. At least there was no flashlight this time. The sounds became stronger as they neared, and then without warning, the whole colossal, obscene weight of the damp man landed upon George, bearing him to the ground as though he were a child. He clawed his way partly free, only to have fists and knees and shoes in his face. Something hard, a blackjack probably, took him under the ear. He felt and heard Linda fighting desperately at his side against these evil forces. An elbow caught him in the mouth, tearing his lip, just as another and finally decisive weight thundered down on his head. 3. Time had neither meaning nor place in the blackness of the tunnel. When George became conscious, he was lying on his back on the ledge with the salt taste of blood in his mouth. He was alone. There was only the drip of water from the ceiling and walls. Painfully, he hobbled down the rough-hewn steps and felt his way out towards the tunnel's mouth. His watch, lacking a radium dial, availed him nothing. They could be hours ahead of him or merely minutes. He wondered of Linda and breathed a silent prayer for her. His eyes, grown accustomed to the gloom, picked up a patch of white in the tunnel bed ahead of him. That it was a square of paper was all he could see in the darkness, but he picked it up and held it tightly as he stumbled on towards the arch of light that meant the opening of the tube. It was, unthankfully, not minutes but hours. The light of dawn was just arriving in the sky. He studied the ground outside, but there were many footprints, and they were confusing. His head still scrambled from the beating. He had almost forgotten the most important thing, the piece of paper clutched in his hand. He looked at it. It was a page from Linda's address book, and scrawled rudely were two names written in lipstick. Somehow, he surmised, in the dark Linda had been able to scratch this note as they took her from the tunnel and drop it in the darkness. The letters were ill-formed. George sat on a rock and glowered at the piece of paper. The first letter was a V. The last seemed to be lift, but then the last letter ran off the page. It meant nothing to him. He crammed the note into his pocket and left the park. Pelgrim went to his apartment, washed and bathed his bruised body, and thought as he'd never thought before. An inspiration came to him after a quick breakfast. He slammed his hat on his head and took a cab to the Gazette offices. One or two of his fellow workers raised their eyebrows at his battered appearance, but without noticing he tore into the morgue, that filing room where research material is stored so essential to every newspaper. He looked up R. Rems. Remsdorf. Here in these files was elaborate advance data all collected, suitable for any occasion, even pre-written obituaries. He ran his finger down the material and finally found what he wanted. It was the fourth name down under real estate holdings that made his heart leap. View Cliffs. He tore at his coat pocket and looked at Linda's note again. Of course, that was what she'd meant to write. He left the file room running, to the astonishment of the supervisor, made his own office in Nothing Flat. Jim Crozier, who shared the room with him, was there typing industriously. "Jim, can I borrow your car?" Pelgrim panted. "It's life and death." "Why, sure, Georgie." The older man turned toward him. "You know my garage. Only this time when you come back, you might leave as much gas as you see in it when you take it out." Crozier whistled. "Hey, your face! What in thunder did you—" But George Pelgrim was gone, sprinting for the elevator. 25 minutes later he was in Crozier's sedan, heading north along the Bryan Parkway. View Cliffs was upstate and on the coast. He knew the general location roughly. It took him 3 hours of hard riding to get there. A local gas station attendant waved his arm in the right direction. "You mean Remsdorf, the millionaire's place? That's right out overlooking the water on the cliffs." George found it, and it was the sort of place you can't reconnoiter in an auto, surrounded by a high wire fence. He cashed his car off a side road and looked the situation over on foot. There was a gate, but it was locked. The fence was high, and every part of it could be seen from the front windows of the ancient castle-like estate that squatted inside the acres like some outre beast. Beyond the house, the land dropped off suddenly, and against its granite sides the sea tumbled thunderously. George stayed out of sight until dark. Then he went to the tree he'd already picked out, shinnied up it, crawled gingerly out on the limb that just poked its outer bark fingers beyond the steel fence, and dropped inside the grounds. Although the night was dark, the reporter took no chances. He ran doubled over, dodging from tree to tree, until he reached an unlighted side of the huge old house. He tried darkened windows until one moved slightly under his fingers. He pushed the frame upward gradually, so it would not squeak, and then he crawled over the sill. He was just inside, with the window lowered back into place, when a shadow passed in front. It was, George could just make out, one of the men who'd accompanied Remsdorf the night before. As though making the rounds, the figure disappeared into the gloom around the corner of the building. As best he could, George explored the chamber he was in and the adjoining rooms. They were all empty and dark. Finally, though, a murmur of voices led him to a doorway which revealed a flight of stairs leading downward. As he crept down them, the voices grew louder, one of them unmistakably Remsdorf's. He turned a bend and crouched on a darkened landing above a large room that spread out before him. The scene was incredible, unforgettable. This room, originally intended for the furnace and service facilities of a huge mansion, had been remodeled into something of an experimental chamber. There was still a huge furnace and a somewhat smaller hot water burner in the corner, but otherwise the room had been transfigured. There were 4 persons in it now, one of them undoubtedly a companion of Remsdorf's from the previous night. The other was a stranger to George Pelgrim. He wore a white medical smock. He had a small black moustache and looked foreign. Remsdorf himself was lolling in a huge oversized steel tub, his shoulders and thick arms lumps of blue-white flesh. And on the table at the far end of the room, her blonde hair tumbling over its end, was Linda Mallory, strapped to the steel surface. Remsdorf was talking, apparently to Linda, although the girl gave little notice that she heard. She was lying on her back, looking fixedly upward, and from her expression, George suspected that she was either in a deeply shocked condition or under some form of sedation. The white-coated, moustached figure hovered around her, and even as the reporter looked, he fixed a tourniquet on her left forearm. The damp man pulled himself laboriously out of the huge tub, and stood nude, except for a breechcloth around his middle, while the one, evidently a doctor, made a small, quick incision in his arm, and nodded enthusiastically at the result. George's muscles stiffened as he heard a sob from Linda. She turned her head away from the scene about to unfold, and at that precise moment, Pelgrim felt something hard dig into his back, and a voice said, "You again, huh?" He started to turn, but the revolver jabbed deeper into his spine. "None of that. March straight down." It was the twin of the gunman below, the other one from last night, the one Pelgrim had seen earlier making the rounds of the house. Remsdorf bellowed as the two came down the stairs. It was a bellow of triumph and amusement rather than rage.
"You're in time for a good show, Pelgrim. As your employer..."
His laughter rumbled wetly.
"I recommend it highly."
He directed his aides to tie George to a chair, and waved away the accented little doctor who approached holding a hypodermic in one hand like a suggestion.
"Not yet. We want him to see what is going on. Time enough for him later."
Remsdorf postured before the reporter like a huge, bloated pollywog.
"You're about to see my fondest dream consummated. You have been a stupid and at times unwitting obstacle, but of course I have defeated you. Linda Mallory is mine, as I willed she should be. Perhaps it is only right that you followed us here and will now see the final chapter. I do not know, Pelgrim, whether you believed me or not when I said that I and Miss Mallory were about to embark on a great biological experiment. It is entirely true. We shall raise a new race of humans, a far more indestructible race, capable of powers and talents beyond the human ken. I myself am different, Pelgrim, as you know. I hope and believe it will be possible to make my difference Linda Mallory's difference. And then," he shrugged his shoulders, "a race of us which will eventually rule the world. The first prerequisite, though," he explained elaborately, "is to drain her veins, her organs, and her entire body of blood, which our present-day unimaginative scientists believe is essential to life. Instead, she will receive a transfusion of life fluid from me, and she and I will become one. It is not necessary. In fact, it would be useless to explain the scientific and medical factors involved here. Suffice it that you will be watching the world's greatest biological experiment, Pelgrim. It's entirely fitting that the last event of your life before, shall we say, your demise, should be of such momentous caliber." He motioned to the doctor. "You may proceed." The white-coated man moved swiftly to Linda's side and inspected the tourniquet on her forearm again. Linda struggled and tried desperately to turn her head far enough to look at George, but the thongs holding her were too cruelly tight. Remsdorf seated himself on a bench at the girl's side, and the doctor applied a tourniquet to his arm also. He then bent to a table
and came up with a small shining knife and a length of rubber tubing with large needles affixed to both ends. He turned towards Linda's arm, and at his movement, George, with a tremendous effort, threshed mightily and toppled his chair over. In an instant, the two sallow gunmen were upon him, guns raised, but Remsdorf's sharp orders caused them only to right Pelgrim's chair.
"I want him to see this," Remsdorf rumbled.
The doctor, distracted by the sound, bent again to his work. George watched fascinatedly as the needle neared Linda's forearm vein. The reporter was watching so closely, straining so tensely, that when he thought about it afterward, the following sequence of events seemed somewhat muddled. At any rate, the gaping blue hole in the white-coated technician's head seemed to appear before the thunderous crash of sound came from the stairs. Actually, the two must have occurred simultaneously, and the doctor sank soundlessly to the floor. One of the gunmen clawed wildly at his own pocket, and an explosive roar greeted his action. The other aide hurled himself at the stairs, only to be caught in mid-air by an impact that sent him reeling and kicking to the ground. Only then did Pelgrim turn his head away from the carnage, the three dead lying there. What he saw was the oldest, strangest man holding the biggest revolver he'd ever seen. As he stepped down the stairs and came into the basement room, he seemed to grow smaller. He was bowed slightly, and a mane of white hair came a quarter ways down his back. There'd been horror enough in that room, yet the greatest of all was on Lothar Remsdorf Jr.'s face as he stared past Pelgrim at the tiny, advancing figure.
"Father."
The words hissed out, and the damp man rose, trembling in every fleshy part. "Yes," the little man admitted, and he advanced silently on his monster son, his eyes as he passed Pelgrim a blazing blue fury, not of this world. George was struggling furiously to work himself free from the chair, and had already managed to loosen one wrist. Linda lay rigid with terror. Meanwhile, the struggle of wills between the two men before him continued.
"You're dead,"
wheezed the fat man, backing away.
"You're dead. I know you are, because
you arranged for my death. Ah, but you, my son, you are not dead, and that is something which must be righted. I created you out of the brine, out of the molecule, and out of the protoplasm, and where other men return to dust, you will return to your medium." He motioned Remsdorf towards the steel tub, and hypnotically the giant man obeyed, easing himself into the water, while all the time his horror-dilated eyes were unable to leave the old man's face. Pelgrim was almost free now. One leg was loosening too. The old man went on. "You are in your coffin, your grave and your tomb, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. You shall be unable to return to this life." The damp man was as though paralyzed in the huge steel tub of water. Only his eyes showed movement as he followed the old man's backward steps. The gun was out of the ancient's hand now. He stopped in front of the huge hot water furnace. He took a pail and a shovel and opened the door. He heaped the pail full of live red coals, and then he stalked towards where his son waited for him, unmoving with the hypnotic terror that froze him in his watery vat. "No!" shouted Pelgrim with a scream that forced the words from his lips. But the old man paid no attention. The reporter's thoughts were for Linda, and he flung himself towards her, covering her face and her ears as best he could. Even as he did, the old man emptied the live pan of flaming coals into the tub. The water began to boil, but the screams of agony which Pelgrim expected were not forthcoming. Instead, the damp man's face grew less and then liquidated. His giant limbs and torso seemed to take up the gurgling boiling of the water until,
as though in imitation, the all of him cold and heaved and boiled and bubbled too, and then, entirely magically and impossible because Pelgrim had been watching every instant, there was nothing in the tub but the roil of still boiling water, and in the bottom, showing from under the now darkened coals, the breechcloth lying slack as a towel. The old man was gone up the stairs, and into the night from whence he'd come, and Linda, thankfully, was sobbing in George's arms, while he desperately thought up some tale to comfort her, and to explain the disappearance of the evil being, Lothar Remsdorf Jr., a man who had perhaps never quite been, and who was now only a vanishing mist of steam around the dome light of the room, and beaded droplets against the high windows, looking out to sea.
The Damp Man Again, by Allison V. Harding. 1. Experiences with madmen seem commonplace, judging by the daily press, but an individual case among one's own acquaintance is less easy to come upon. The mad experimentalists, dear both to the hearts of Hollywood Grade B movie producers and the writers of thrill fiction, are, happily for the general populace, something of a rarity. George Pelgrim, of the Gazette, and one of that newspaper's ablest and most discerning reporters, was well aware that, in this instance, he had a sensational and bona fide case of the kind that would abash even some of the most colourful writers of lurid make-believe. The adventures that Pelgrim had just had with the Damp Man, that fabulous, beyond normal, unhuman, the living testimony of an experiment which should never have been undertaken, had stimulated the young reporter's mind to a degree that made the taboo attitude on the story from his city desk hard to take. The Damp Man, Lothar Remsdorf Jr., now no more, Pelgrim mused as he sat in the huge old house at View Cliffs overlooking the sea, was an explosive subject. The man himself, even if not that in the true sense biologically, had borne a name that meant both wealth and power. Enough wealth and power to squash not only a relatively insignificant reporter like Pelgrim, but also any paper, however large and influential, that stood behind him. A sample of this that still loomed large in George's mind was the memory of the fact, incredible but true, that Remsdorf, to suit his purposes at the end of their recent duel, had even bought Pelgrim's paper, the Gazette. A man who would go to such extremes to further some small phase of his outlandish plans was, of course, not sane. Remsdorf had not been sane any more than he'd been normal. A man of strange, peculiar content, his body filled with an outlandish physiological proportion of water, immune to many of the menaces from which the average flesh cringes, for a well-aimed bullet or knife thrust, an open door for the letting of the life's blood of any other individual, was merely as a gnat's bite to Remsdorf. The man had no blood in the medical man's sense of the word, but merely a watery, colourless substance. His vital organs, despite the immense size of him, were compressed and hidden away within the fluid fat monstrousness of the creature. There was a brain that could guide the senses, the sight and hearing and speech, and it could think with a cunning that far exceeded the average. Lothar Remsdorf Jr.'s obsession was the obsession that is often peculiarly the part of the abnormal. In his awful abnormality, with its connotations of inferiority, he will develop a philosophy that finally accepts the certitude that the inferiority, the difference is, in reality, a vast superiority. It was Lothar Remsdorf's undying obsession, his destiny, that he would found a new race that drove him along strange paths and byways, into actions of both criminal and murderous intent. The fact that he chanced upon Linda Mallory, the blonde swimmer of statuesque beauty, was undoubtedly coincidence. But with this aquatic star, Ramsdorf's dream of a new racial empire flourished. The girl's feelings concerning his sinister advances mattered not one whit, and it was in this connection that George, covering a swimming meet, had met Linda, filled with fear instead of a swimming victor's sense of satisfaction. The persistent efforts of Ramsdorf Jr. to force Linda to become his bride, to kidnap her or to obtain her by any means or method, made for an incredulous tale that his own gazette would have none of. But Pelgrim had kept an account of the happenings, and as a self-styled biographer of the Ramsdorf case, he was unquestionably more intimate with it than any other living person. George had long since taken the exhausted Linda Mallory back to the city, but something composed in part of curiosity and part of compulsion sent him back on a return trip to the old mansion overlooking the sea. He had let himself in through a side door, purposely left open, and found himself surrounded by the sombre, huge emptiness of the ancient building in that part of night that is deepest and most silent. The basement, turned into an experimental chamber, held little but paraphernalia and equipment, most of which were beyond his ken. He worked methodically from room to room, the single ray of his flashlight probing and searching here and there. Now the wind from seaward would rattle a shutter or whistle in the eaves, and he would straighten, and for a moment chill with expectation. Then the reassuring thought of the monster's demise would soothe his tired and jangled nerves, and Pelgrim would go back to his searching. Upstairs, in a giant, black-panelled room with high-vaulted ceiling, George found himself face to face with a huge portrait of Lothar Ramsdorf Jr. It seemed huge because the man was huge. The painting was life-size, realistic even down to the drab black clothes, the broadness and grossness, and the white, fleshy face, eyes almost inhuman hidden behind puffs of cheekbones and eyebrows. The likeness was extraordinary. The eyes looked forward directly into George's own eyes, and if he moved around the room from any point in it, he could feel them on him. The mouth was stern, the thick lips set. The artist, whoever he may have been, had certainly captured the very spirit and soul of his sinister subject. Or, George's journalistic mind admitted precisely, the painter had captured the very soullessness of the creature. It was while the Gazette's reporter was looking full into the portrait's face that he had the sudden idea that was almost a compulsion sending him forward. He swiveled the picture, and its hanging wire swiveled it further, and there behind it was the knob of a wall safe. In the workroom of the basement, George soon found a crowbar. Returning, he attacked the hiding place with vigor, and after a while, its smallness and vulnerability gave in to the attack. The door sagged open on metal hinges, and he shoved his light inside. There was, of course, the instantaneous disappointment of not finding neat pack after pack of crisp high-denomination bills. George had never opened a safe before, but his fiction reading told him to expect something of that nature. Instead, there was nothing inside here but a book. He drew it out and opened its brown leather cover. It was a diary, the diary of Lothar Ramsdorf Jr. Pelgrim carefully pushed the bent safe door back into some approximation of its original position, swiveled the picture into place, and found himself a relatively comfortable inside room, where the light from his torch could not possibly be seen from outside. He was, he reminded himself, trespassing in every sense of the word. The facts of what had taken place in that house early that night mattered not in the eyes of the law, and their unquestioned feeling towards him should he be apprehended roaming around a house to which he did not belong. In spite of this, Pelgrim settled into a chair and found himself reading. As he followed the words put down in a tight scroll on the lined pages of the diary, he felt himself living through the eyes and senses of the person or thing who'd written these words. As he perused page after page, his mind flashed back to his earlier episodes with the Damp Man, back to the events in this very house, and such a little while ago, when Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had contrived to make Linda Mallory into the same sort of being that he himself was, so that between them there'd come to be a race of different and superior biological and physiological creatures. As Pelgrim read on, he found himself walking down the dark streets of night with Remsdorf Jr. in many strange places. The Damp Man's thoughts became his own, perhaps not necessarily through any power of Lothar's writings in the diary, but because of Pelgrim's own imagination and his intimacy with the whole Outre affair. When Lothar Remsdorf Jr. walked the outskirts of an industrial town, finding a little factory girl who resisted his advances, Pelgrim could feel the whole thing. And that moment, the same night, with her referring to the Damp Man as, "You fat slob, get away from me," he could see the sudden burst of energy that transformed the elephantine monster into a lightning-quick creature of destruction for all his size. And he could visualize the slack, limp thing that lay at the side of the road beyond the outskirts of the farthest lights from the tavern, a bundle of useless inertness that a moment ago had been the factory girl, who had decided with a woman's right that Remsdorf wasn't the kind of fellow she wanted to have an evening's fun with. Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had but to write a check for any amount, and the money was his. It was a fact of his life that he accepted as he accepted his physical proportions, which were immense, and those other things. The father that had begot him, the scientist-experimentalist father was, he felt very sure, destroyed now in a burst of maniacal frenzy against the man whose blunder had done this to him. Like a drunken mother who drops her year-old baby downstairs, dooming it to life as a cripple. For Lothar had known. It had been evident, as his mind had grown to catch up with his body, from the first time perhaps that he had shaved, and the blade, as it will with men all over the world, had slipped and cut deeply, and what had spurted forth had not been blood. Not blood, but a strange, watery serum. He remembered the country physician he'd seen almost by accident in some small community when he'd crushed his hand at some now-forgotten task. The physician, on examining him, had been amazed. There had been questions, so many questions that Remsdorf had finally fled, not answering, leaving the country practitioner to doubt his own sanity, to inquire into the back recesses of his mind if he'd been drunk the night the man with the crushed hand came, or if he, a humble country doctor, had seen the ninth wonder of the world. Remsdorf's injured hand had filled and righted itself, and he found that physical injuries and diseases to which the flesh of normal man falls heir were not to be his. But there were other matters less advantageous. With all his cellular and metabolic differences, there was a likeness to his fellow men that made his path difficult. Like his fellow men, he sat through his share of burlesque shows and musical comedies, ogling the stripped and semi-stripped females that paraded their tired bodies before the public. And, as time passed, his yearning, which was a part of some other man he might have been before those things that had been done to him, that yearning became a hatred, and the hatred a scheming cunning. With his money, of course there were girls. For enough money you can get almost anything in this world, sad but true. They were girls from the poorer circumstances of life as a rule, whose loathing for him showed through their set smiles as they accepted his advances as a necessary part of a
very unpleasant way of getting by. He looked at them as one does at dolls in a toy store, and these that came to him were of usual kinds. Most of them were scrawny, with pasty faces and straight hair, thin bodies and high-pitched voices. There were some that were fleshy, lumpy, and bulging in the wrong places, their figures sagging with their memories, trying to appear younger than they were, which wasn't young. In common, the thin and the fat had their dyed hair and their screeching voices and their speech, which was hep, they liked to think, and in the vernacular. And they hated him, which he knew, and he hated them, which in all their smallness of soul and stupidity they still did not know. But they were none of them what he wanted, for gradually Lothar Remsdorf Jr. was evolving a plan and an idea which would make of him not a despised, loathsome creature, but a superior Superman, which was what he indubitably was. He was, he knew by now with a real understanding, something like that fictional thrill-getter, the zombie, the walking dead. Things in his midnight wanderings and experiences happened to him that would injure, cripple, or kill an ordinary mortal. He was, for instance, hit by an auto on Chicago State Street one night. The auto was going much too fast, and his heavy body was thrown through the air to land with a wet smack on the curbstones. But, he thought with some amusement afterward, the woman driver's shock was much greater when she saw him rise, leaving behind no blood but the damp imprint of his great abnormal body on the sidewalk, than if he had remained there, a self-respecting corpse in a pool of honest blood. Oh, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had something. He was relatively invulnerable. Who knows, he might be immortal. It was a titillating thought, and spurred him on to find the maiden of his ideal with whom he could appropriately start a new and mightier racial strain. There was, first of all, Joy. He'd seen her first at a fashionable country club horse show, her raven-black hair falling down around her perfect oval face, the riding habit setting off the well-built figure as she sat her horse. Introductions had to be made. At that level people were considerably more conventional, as the educated usually are, for to the world Remsdorf appeared simply as a large and obese man with a somewhat forbidding, unhandsome face, and a penchant, if he did not disguise the fact with his dark clothes, of perspiring too much. However, Joy was easy, and the whole thing looked quite propitious. With the introductions and the behind-the-hands whispering that probably dealt with his size and unattractiveness were words from the same sources that spoke of his immense wealth. And it so happened at that moment in the world's history that Joy Sutter's family were hard up and in considerable need of some refinancing. That irrevocable fact helped to gloss over some of Remsdorf's more obvious shortcomings. And before long, the damp man and the raven-haired beauty could be seen at country socials and functions. Remsdorf felt he was getting somewhere, with occasional invitations from the family. He realized and recognized in himself a consuming desire to at least ape other men in some ways, and marriage would be the logical consummation of this. Joy was an attractive playmate. Her limbs were well moulded, her face finely chiseled, and her family properly anxious, even if, as Remsdorf knew intuitively, it was his bankroll that concerned them, rather than the innate qualities that went with the man. The two talked occasionally, said what was necessary to and from the country club or the beach club, and as the weeks passed, Lothar permitted himself the measured optimism of one who sees his goal coming within reach. There had been, up to this time, no such intimacies as are commonplace among the young country sets. The night of the Frost Island barbecue, Remsdorf, arrayed in his usual dark suit, which had now come to be at least openly accepted by the beach club, squired Joy Sutter. The island was not far off the shore frontage of the yacht club, and the guests made the trip in small boats. It was a lark,
as the girls in gay-coloured shorts or slacks and their escorts took to the water in whatever type of craft seemed most easily available. Some commandeered small sailing boats, while others with more ambition or stronger backs ventured forth in rowboats. There were a few power craft, and Joy whispered to Lothar of a skiff with outboard motor, of which she knew the whereabouts. The black-haired girl, who'd been reared in the sort of society that knew well its piano lessons, how to sit a horse, set a star canvas, and spin the flywheel of an outboard, showed her bulky companion the working of the small motor. Then, laughing at his clumsiness, she let Remsdorf take over, and they pushed off from land, following the others out across tranquil evening water to Frost Island. The trip took a good half-hour, but Lothar, watching the hair of the girl seated in the bow of the boat, the long tresses wind-blown backward like a dark pennant in the twilight, wished it took longer. They did not speak, because it was hard to be understood over the putt of the outboard, but once or twice she smiled at him, and it kindled the sense of anticipation Remsdorf had brought with him this night. For tonight he had decided to ask Joy, the blessing of her family assured, he knew, to be his wife. The barbecue was like a barbecue. They roasted frankfurters, toasted rolls, ate pickles, and played foolish games that were all the more foolish at their age. After a while, the liquid refreshments took on a potency that lessened the inhibitions of the party. As the gaiety of the picnickers increased, Remsdorf, taking a drink here and there for appearance sake, nevertheless found himself at the outskirts of the laughing, singing, and joking groups. It bothered him particularly that his Joy, he was allowing himself to think of her in that way now, was paying less and less attention to him as the evening progressed, and more to the group of tanned, broad-shouldered young men who inevitably circle around an attractive girl. It was possible, probable, that with the number of drinks consumed, Joy's concern for the hard circumstances surrounding the Sutter family's life diminished, and her perception of the attraction of other young men increased. Lothar made several attempts to catch her eye, and finally forced himself forward to stand by her side.
"Joy,"
he said, in his rumbling, cavernous voice. She stopped laughing long enough to look at him briefly.
"Let's walk up the beach a ways."
She pointed at him and giggled, swaying a bit unsteadily on her feet. One of the tanned young men with the broad shoulders leaned forward to support her. "Who's your blimp boyfriend?" Everybody laughed. Remsdorf seethed and withdrew to stand again in the background, unseen, his dark suit blending into the night blackness of the island beyond the rim of firelight. Later, Remsdorf saw his chance and seized it. The cavaliers, drawn away by various drink-fetching tasks, left Joy standing alone for a minute, and in that time Remsdorf was by her again, drawing her away from the firelight. "No, no," she protested in a thick voice. "Don't want to go." But it was nothing for his thick arm to propel her as he wanted. It was getting late, and the rumble of anger in his own breast had found an answer far westward in the night sky. There was a storm coming, and after all, he had promised himself that tonight was to be theirs. He drew her down beside him on a rock facing the dark, now still water. The romance of the night was curtailed by her unwillingness, but he held her there against any desire to run back to the young men at the barbecue.
"Joy,"
he breathed, and the words came out with a giant exhalation.
"I want you to be my wife."
He had been holding her by the shoulders somewhat tightly, and became conscious of it when she relaxed completely. He thought that was the response he sought, but then he felt her shoulders heaving. He wondered why she sobbed, until the awful truth overtook him. It was laughter, and she shook with it. "You!" she finally managed to gasp. "You!" and then her words became unintelligible for the laughter. He felt a great shaking starting deep inside of him, but it was a different emotion from hers, and his giant arms and hands tensed.
Your family,
he rumbled, playing his strong card, which now seemed pitifully deuce low.
Your family, they approve.
The girl swayed against him and away, as though moved inexorably by the gusts of her own mirth. I marry you! In a second more, he knew his rage would be a bigger thing than her laughter. But in that second, the gloom that shrouded this dreadful scene was flecked and streaked with bobbing light. It was one of the tanned young cavaliers carrying a torch and calling, Joy! Joy, darling! Where are you? She got up unsteadily, but quick enough to evade the damp man's grab, and then she was running towards the light and the young man, still giggling at the huge joke, chattering about it. And as she went back towards the barbecue, it seemed that those she met and learned of it laughed with her, until the sound was proportionately larger than the man who caused it. Then it began to rain, as it does on a summer night, softly and suddenly, without warning, from a sky that hides behind the darkness. It rained harder, as though for the unshed tears in Remsdorf's giant body, and the barbecue fire sputtered and sizzled out. The merrymakers oohed with disappointment and tried to tuck themselves away under what scant shrubbery the island afforded, the men holding jackets over the girls' heads. But the wind began to blow, and the wisest of the yacht club set advised that the trip back to the mainland should be started immediately, or they might well be stuck for the night on Frost Island. People ran, and the boats drawn up along the beach were rapidly filled. Remsdorf, forgotten now in the confusion and the big joke that he had afforded all of them, walked until he saw the boat Joy was in. It was raining even harder, and she was already in the prow. Bloater waited until the young man with the two broad shoulders had started the outboard and was about to push off. Remsdorf stepped forward then, got into the boat with an ungainly lurch, and shoved the young man hard, viciously. In the next instant, one giant leg had pushed out mightily, and they were afloat and free, the voice of the bested swain lost in the general confusion and the growing sounds of the storm. When Joy turned and saw his bulk at the outboard instead of the tanned young man, the flickering lightning showed her disgust, but the mirth was gone. The water that drove her black hair flat to her head had also driven some of the liquor out of her befuddled brain. She turned and stared ahead. For a while, there were other boats around, and Lothar steered by watching them. But in the blackness and rising water, they soon found themselves alone. He called out, the harsh rumble of his voice rising above the water slap against the hull and the beat of the rain.
Which way, Joy?
She hesitated a moment, and then pointed mutely. He wondered if she knew for sure, and that was a small joke for him. Water came over the prow now, and Joy moved back into the center of the skiff. The wind grew strong enough even to lift the heavy, wet strands of her hair, to spin their skiff this way and that, and cause this girl, who had derided him a moment ago, to turn her frightened, rain-streaked face towards him beseechingly. And that was when the damp man laughed, a hearty echo to her girlish peals of the earlier evening.
Scared, Joy?
He called above the shrieking wind, and she sat amidships and stared back at him, her eyes widened by what she saw in his face. Suddenly the words came, the hysteria, the cries and screams. But the boat drove on into the ever heavier seas, and the black water coming over the side slopped at their feet. She screamed again, but her words were unintelligible things. She prayed, she entreated, but there was no one to hear but Lothar Remsdorf, and he enjoyed this game more than any of the others they'd played on the island. She should enjoy it too, he thought ironically, for it would be her last. The skiff was narrow of beam, and as he moved his gigantic weight from one side to the other, the craft would dip sharply and take in more and more water. Joy would try to counterbalance by throwing herself against the lifted thwart, but it was as a matchstick. It was a glorious moment for him as he drove the foundering skiff directly into the head sea, felt that last wave sweep into them and over them, and the boat, a dead, lonely thing now, drop away beneath them. She was at him, a cat in the water, clawing and grabbing, and if she made noise, the wave slapped it from her mouth. Her eyes were big from the horror of it, and gradually, using his weight easily, he forced her under by her shoulders, and then her head. He thought at the time that Joy's struggles were pitifully feeble, that this girl's effort for life was a poor thing, lasting for but a short time. He held her beneath the churning water with his knees and the full-length reach of his tremendous arms for a bit longer, and then pulled her up, holding her by the hair, looking at her face set in final, twisted agony. As he threw this dead, lifeless thing away from him, he wondered how he had ever found her pretty or desirable, and he was glad it had happened this way. Then he took to the business of swimming, an entirely familiar and effortless act, for water was his medium, and in water he revelled. His ponderous strokes did not speed, with concession to the storm, but took their time, and finally there was something under his feet. He found land, walked up on it a ways, and, although not feeling the need for rest, laid down when he was a reasonable distance from the water. It would look better this way. Joy was the only casualty, but 2 other boats had overturned, and there had been some close calls. Remsdorf was contriteness personified with the Sutters. He told his simple, straightforward story that they had been swamped in the storm, and at the first moment of going over, he had lost track of Joy in the confusion. He had called out and swum in circles as nearly as he could, but had not seen her again. The girl's body was found a few days later. The verdict of accidental drowning was confirmed, and at the ceremony the usual moistness of Remsdorf's face was taken for tears of exquisite sorrow. But the quest must continue. He knew that as he slipped away from the country community and made his way to the city. There were other girls, other trials and errors, but Remsdorf, with experience, was cagier. And then finally there was Terry. Terry, who sang with a band in a downtown joint. Two. Terry was young, maybe so young she had to lie her way into this present employment. She had looks and sparkle. She was medium-sized, with big, sensual breasts of a much larger girl. Remsdorf saw her first in her place of employment, singing some tired song about love and moon and June, in a low-cut evening dress that showed her off to considerable advantage. The song didn't matter. There were 10,000 husky contraltos, but the evening dress did. It caught his attention and every male eye in the place. A $20 bill to the head waiter got him through a dingy backstairs route to Terry's dressing room, and another 20 did wonders to get the introductions off running. "Miss Wilson, this is Mr. Loda Remsdorf, Jr. Says he liked your singing. Wanted to meet you." The eyebrow of the flunky dipped appropriately to signify, "Sucker, sucker. I got into him a little. Now it's your turn." "Thanks, Maurice." It was the same husky contralto, and it sounded good in the tiny, untidy dressing room, better even than when it whispered love and moon and June in front of the blasé 5-piece orchestra. Remsdorf said something about going out somewhere with him and having a drink. He'd like to talk to her about opportunities. She was still wearing the dress, and he ogled, and that pleased her, for that was obviously what the dress was for. The date was that easily arranged, and as promised, she met him later, after she'd had time to slip into something else. The something else was also entirely alluring, and as they chatted at an expensive uptown nightclub, Terry spoke of admiring clothes that bring out my personality. Remsdorf smirked at that, and thought the girl was either very stupid or very smart, but what did it matter? As time passed, Terry Wilson became the new addition of Joy Sutter. By this time, at considerable expense and trouble, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had amassed as much as possible of his father's scientific experimental data and notes prior to the explosion which had taken the scientist's life. They dealt in the main, of course, with the experiment of which the Damp Man himself was the product. It occurred to him, increasingly, that in the development of this new and biologically superior race on Earth, there should be as little as possible left to chance. The girl he would choose for the ultimate experiment would be subjected to the same radiatory and physiological therapies as he himself had withstood to emerge as he was now. Terry Wilson, all unknowing of course, accepted his gifts, saw him more than occasionally, and went on singing at the joint. It happened not too much later that Terry, one evening at an outside cafe, bent her finger around Lotus's suit cuff and cooed at him in her voice that came with the huskiness when she wanted something particularly. But this was troublesome because it could not be bought at a store. It was in the nature of a sort of ultimatum. "No, honey, I'm just not going to be able to see you next week. Got some friends coming on next week, and I'm going to be pretty busy." Remsdorf tried petulance, tried the suggestion that he would withdraw his generous patronage, but she made a face at him that said she knew he didn't mean it and couldn't do it. He took his troubles a few days later to the manager of the joint, where he'd first spied Terry. The manager's friendship and ear had been long since won over by good denomination bills from the Remsdorf wallet. The manager was a canny man. He had ideas. It was he who joked within hearing of his female singer about her low-cut dresses, saying that she sang with her body instead of her voice, which last she ain't got much of. Terry didn't seem to mind. The friends were people the joint's boss just didn't know much about, was all Remsdorf got for his pumping. The manager thought the Wilson girl had been in with a fast, tough kind of crowd, but what she did with her spare time was no concern of his, this with a shrug of the shoulder. Lothar hired a private detective, and that worthy stuck to Terry during the week when she couldn't see the Damp Man. His reports were duly filed. The chap, so discovered the Damp Man, was one Frankie Macklin, a boy with a bad reputation in the Midwest, a police record, and some dubious activities. Macklin had along with him a couple of rugged muscle men who'd also known the inside of a detention pen and looked it. The week up, the private eye went back to divorce cases, and Remsdorf went back to Terry. When he asked her who her friends were and how about an introduction, she blew smoke at him. "Just friends, Big Bear." She had a habit of calling him that, and he didn't mind. He'd been called worse things. It was a tug of war, and neither of them gave in. "Well, if you don't trust me, and anyway, you don't own me," she flounced off, looking, as the storybooks say, prettier in anger than he'd ever seen her. He stayed for all her appearances the next night, listened to her sing, and agreed more than ever with the critical opinion of her voice offered by the manager. When he tried to make up afterwards, she pouted. Phone calls to her hotel were not put through, and Remsdorf paced the floor, unable to rest his giant bulk until some break in their quarrel. As a few more days passed, the Damp Man pounded the lobby of her hotel. He ingratiated himself with the house detective there, only to find after the exchange of considerable folding stuff that Terry was no longer in the building, but had moved to another dwelling, the exact whereabouts unknown. His contacts at the joint also shrugged their shoulders. Where Miss Wilson lived, after all, was her own business. She didn't need to share that knowledge with her employers. Terry continued to warble her songs, and her low-cut dresses fascinated the patrons, as they had Remsdorf. Then, unexpectedly, he got a phone call from her. She was at the Apex Hotel. Could he come over? He went, and she greeted him affectionately in something flimsy. She apologized for her behavior, but she'd been in some trouble. Well, not recently, but something she'd inherited long ago from her family. She knew he'd understand, but it was important that she get out of this city. He knew how those things were. Now she had an opportunity somewhere else to get her own place, but it would take a little capital. Well, she didn't know how much. She didn't even know the exact details. Perhaps the whole thing wouldn't come off, but she just wondered if he wouldn't help her just a little. The meeting was one of forgiveness and promises. She ran her hand through his hair and pinched his big fleshy cheek. But once, when she turned her head away, he caught the look on her face in the across-room mirror. It was the same look he'd seen on so many women's faces. It made him feel as he'd felt many times before. But Terry, even playing at love, was better, he guessed, than most other girls in sincerity.
"Terry," he murmured in his rumbling, deep-from-within voice, "you know I'd back you in any venture and for any amount. There's something else, though. If you go away, I want to go wherever you go. You see, Terry, I've been thinking about asking you to become—"
She hushed him there, but with a mixture of shyness and provocativeness that made him feel he'd been gauche and abrupt. "Don't let's talk about that now," she pleaded. With a giant hand, he took his checkbook out of his pocket. "Oh dear, not that either now, Big Bear. Honey, you must think I'm interested in you just because you've got money." He left, and that part of him, that part of his highly sensitive and beyond normal cerebellum that told him the whole thing was a sham and a fake, was definitely subordinated to the rest of him that thrilled to her and her words and the evening they'd spent together. He went home, and the water-like serum that coursed through his veins and body pumped feverishly, his great hands gripping and ungripping, his mind filled with what would come next. In the next few days he saw Terry, but no more intimately than the others who came to the cheap night spot to ogle and hear her sing. She waved at him. Once he caught up with her just outside of her dressing room, and she shook her head with a little frown that stopped him. "No, please, I have so much to think about. I'm going to get in touch with you soon, though. I need you." That held Lothar until her summons. She called him one morning very early, so early that the position of the hands of the clock made him disbelieve that it could be her. "It's Terry," she repeated again. He sat up sleepily, holding the instrument in one huge, moist paw, but the huskiness of her voice charmed him, as it always had. The early hour took nothing away. "Look," she relayed, "this thing I've been telling you about. You know, I think the break's come. I'm quitting my job. After tonight's the last."
"You're leaving town?" he rumbled.
Yes, this is really an opportunity, darling. But I want you to go with me, and I was wondering—" Her voice hung there like ripe fruit refusing to drop until she continued. "You said," a slight inflection there, "you'd like to help."
"Of course I did, and I would."
"Well, you see, just to get started—"
"How much?"
broke in Remsdorf.
"Just tell me, and it's yours."
"It seems like an awful lot. $10,000?
"I'll get it as soon as the bank opens."
"You're a darling. I don't know what I'd do without you, Big Bear."
"When do you want it?"
he asked, pleased at the warmth in her voice.
I'll tell you, she thought audibly. I've got a little feeling that maybe they won't be too keen about me after running out on the joint tonight. I think you'd better meet me somewhere and we'll leave. Is that okay?
Anything you say, Terry.
I'll call you and tell you where later.
As you say.
Oh, and darling, I know the way you rich men are. Don't go and get that 10,000 in the great big fat bills I suppose you're used to. We're going to need it for silly things like train fare and hotels and getting settled out there, together. The together made Remsdorf hang up with pleasurable expectancy. Later in the day, he drew out the money in 5s, 10s, and 20s. It made a good-sized envelope full, and stuffed the whole in his inside breast pocket. He waited in his room that evening, his gigantic form overflowing the largest chair, big blunt fingers tapping restlessly on the telephone table. As midnight approached, he wondered if the bad night had caused any change in her plans, for it was storming outside, a continuous spring drizzle that streaked his high-up hotel room windows. But a few minutes after midnight, the phone jangled. He picked it up, and she said, "Darling, it's Terry. All set to meet me?"
"I've been waiting," he intoned.
"I'll tell you where." And she gave him an address across town. "That's not far from the uptown railway station," she said.
"Are they sorry you're leaving down there at the club?"
"Oh, heavens," she deplored. "Don't let's go into that. You know how these people are. Won't give you an inch if they think you can better yourself. I think Joe, the manager, is going to lasso me at the last minute to try and stop me from going. You be there and promptly at 1 sharp. There's a train a few minutes later we can catch." He agreed, dutifully. "Oh, and darling, you have the money, of course?" "Good. That's mighty important to us." He left the hotel in the rain, took a cab to the other side of town, to the directed address. It was in a poor section of warehouses and run-down tenements. Just beyond the intersection where one of the squalid streets met the avenue, the railroad, which from here to downtown burrowed underground in its lower tunnel, came out into the open beneath the high-walled sides, to become further up an elevated that ran above the dirty city streets until it reached the outskirts to run level again and regain its true character. Lothar paid the cab off and stood on the corner under a dingy street lamp. His watch said 1:45. Better early than late. A rumble beneath the sidewalk on which he stood developed into a shooting, lighted thing that rushed out onto the suddenly exposed tracks beyond the embankment and opening of the tunnel. He watched the train flow westward, changing the semaphores as it fled beneath them, from green to red. With the train gone away into the distance, there was nothing left but the soft, persistent hiss of the rain. That, with the lateness of the hour, drove whatever life there might be left in these squalid surroundings far away, indoors. It contributed a feeling as though he were alone in the world, the damp man thought, and he did not for a minute dislike it. His watch showed a couple of minutes to 1, and he wondered if Terry would be on time or if there would be some slip-up. A moment or so later, he heard from out somewhere beyond the wall of rain and dampness the single steeple chime of a bell tolling the hour. Another train vibrated the spot on which he stood, this time from the outward direction, roaring from the night into the greater darkness of the tunnel and the bright depot at Tube's End. Almost before the rumbling was gone, there was the sound of a motor. Headlights showed down the avenue, and soon the vehicle drew abreast of his position under the street lamp, stopping on the shadowed opposite side. He thought it must be Terry, and then knew he was wrong as 2 men got out of the back. But it must have something to do with her, with him, for they came directly forward. They were medium-sized men with fedoras and trench coats and hands in pockets. Their eyes were white under the street lamp, and their faces drawn and unpleasant. They said nothing, but came closer. The trench coat on the right crossed first, his fist coming out of a pocket. It held a club-like something, and it abruptly swung at the damp man's head. Still no word had been spoken, no sound, except the scuffing, quickened footwork of the two. The blow missed his head and thwacked into a mushy shoulder. Remsdorf grabbed the man with one arm in a bent hook, and then there were voices, sounds. The man squealed and said, "For Christ's sake, Frankie, get him!" The one addressed produced a revolver. "Let go of him. Let's have the dough." Remsdorf tightened his grip on the gasping opponent within his grasp. The car across the street spewed forth another figure, this time the driver, coming to reinforce. Utilizing his gigantic strength in sudden movement, Remsdorf flung the man he'd imprisoned brutally to the ground. There was a sickening thud of head against concrete, and the opposing force had been reduced by one. The one addressed as Frankie was snarling now. The black thing in his hand made noise, and Remsdorf's clothing at his side tugged and tore. Then a sweeping motion of his giant arm sent this man too, crashing to the ground. The third attacker had stopped abruptly, unnerved by the sudden change in the tide of battle, undecided whether to attack or flee. And in that second, the momentous hulk of the damp man was upon him, bearing him to the ground. Then there was almost no sound for a while, but the hissing of the rain. The hissing became louder, or perhaps it was the sound of bodies being dragged across concrete, two at a time, one hand on each collar. It was a game there at the embankment overlooking the mouth of the tunnel. It was a game between Remsdorf and the signals, and he rumbled with deep, moist laughter as he hoisted first one body and then the other over the fence that guarded the tracks below, toppling them down with a gentle shove. In the next moment, there was the small earthquake again, and a train poured out of its tunnel hiding place to tear and pound over those insignificant gunny sack-like things that lay across the rails. When Remsdorf turned with a smile on his wet face, the one called Frankie had raised himself on elbow, his face the face of one who has looked into hell and is too stunned to fully believe what he saw. But Frankie still had the black thing in his hand, and the revolver spoke again and again as the damp man moved for him slowly, laughing softly. The gun was useless with emptiness before Lota's measured treads took him within reach of the nearly prone figure on the sidewalk, its bullets wasted in the fluid mass of his monster body. The damp man kneeled on the other's chest, pinioning Frankie with his overwhelming weight, and tired of the railroad tunnel game, he placed his mammoth hands on the other man's head and turned it gently, and yet with a firmness that would allow no disobedience. Frankie may have been dead from shock and horror, but if not, the last twist of those hands did for him. The snap was like the sound made by children playing make-believe games with a wishbone, only a man is bigger than a chicken, and his neck vertebra is bigger than the chicken's wishbone. Frankie's head fell slackly, as Lothar Remsdorf, with sudden inspiration, gathered the gunsel up in his arms and made for the car parked across the street. The Apex Hotel was a 25-minute drive through wet streets, deserted in these small hours of the morning. It was a smallish building in an unpretentious section. It catered to the theatrical element, though, and Lothar knew that the lobby could not be counted upon to be empty, even at this hour of nearly 2 a.m. He parked the car a block away, looked up and down to see that the rain-swept street was empty of pedestrians or other traffic, and picked Macklin up with consummate ease, lugging the dead triggerman towards a side entrance, whose small plaque announced service, deliveries. It took but a few devious minutes to find the fire stairs, to mount these stairs carrying the grisly, limp sack of what had once been human, finally reaching 6, Terry's room level. The damp man took his time tiptoeing down the thinly carpeted corridor until he came to the one room over whose door a transom glowed, showing there was light and life within.
The damp man arranged Macklin at his leisure, and then rapped lightly on the door. Terry's voice answered him from within almost immediately. "Come on in. Door's open." Remsdorf turned the knob, pushed the door ajar, just enough to enable him to gently hoist Macklin through the aperture, holding him from behind and remaining himself out of sight. Terry was obviously expecting just what she saw. "Frankie, lover, it didn't take you long. Did you get that fat baboon's money?" It was perhaps only a matter of seconds that Remsdorf held the tableau, but it seemed to him much longer. And then, catering to the searching anger that her remark caused, he took his hand of support from Macklin, at the same time pushing the Gansel forward into the room. He heard Terry's swift intake of breath. In the time that it took her to take another, the damp man was around the door, shutting it by leaning back across the portal with his giant weight. Terry's eyes went from the body on the floor to the looming black-clothed figure that was Remsdorf. She tried a smile, but it was a poor, weak one. Remsdorf came forward with deceptive speed for one his size and bulk. In a second, he was upon her before she had time to scream, although that would have been of little avail at this hour of night, with the storm outside, and the hotel's rooms that were occupied by the sleeping. In another instant, she was in his bare hands, and then she knew enough to do nothing but smile up at him. She was wearing something revealing that she knew he or any other man would like, and she placed her life on that. "Darling," she murmured, using all her willpower to keep the tremble out of her voice and the fear out of her eyes. "Darling, I'm so glad to see you." Remsdorf held her non-committally, and in his small, opaque eyes she could see nothing that told her what her fate might be, only a mirror of her own face, with its set, frozen smile that was a terrible mask, hiding the exploding emotions within. The damp man had been thinking in his ponderous, inexorable, and wholly objective manner, and little surprised him. All the time that Terry had played with him, a side of him, divorced from that part of his nature which had been pleased and flattered, had stood off and evaluated the situation as it really was. Earlier that night, Lothar had recognized that his worst suspicions were probably true. The rendezvous with Terry that turned into a rendezvous with 3 eggs. But during the crosstown drive there was still in the back of his mind, which desperately wanted to believe in her, the thought that possibly this Frankie Macklin and his friends had overheard or somehow come to know about the $10,000 he had withdrawn and was bringing her. That was not entirely beyond the realm of possibility, and they, rather than the girl, had kept the meeting. It was, of course, a small hope to cling to, but it had been with him until that moment when he'd stood the body of Macklin in the opening of the door, and Terry had unknowingly greeted the Gansel affectionately, wondering out loud if he'd hoisted the money from that big baboon. It was, of course, all too plain, whether the fact was a pleasant one to accept or not. Terry played at the game of knowing nothing for a moment, as she drew him back without seeming to the corner of the room, until she came up against her own dressing table. It was a game between them, a silly game, and an entirely deadly one. She used the wiles that women have used from time immemorial, and which she was so naturally well endowed to use. She swayed her body lightly, as well as she could in his restrictive grasp, and she offered her lips, closing her eyes as she did so. And behind her she fumbled with one hand she had won free at something in her dressing-table drawer. He slapped her first across the mouth. It was not hard, but his hand was heavy, and it made a wet sound. She opened her eyes wide with the shock of the blow, and saw that it was only the first. But she had what she wanted now, and when her free hand came out from behind her, it held a knife. She was sure he didn't see, his bulk looming so far above her, bending her backward. When she struck him in the back with the blade, driving it home with all the strength of her arm, she tried to swivel sideways to free herself from his monstrous body when it would fall in agony from her attack. Instead, there was no more satisfying reaction on the damp man's part than a tightening of his hands on her shoulders. It was incredible to her, and this part was the worst of it. Her flaying arms caught at the weapon buried to its hilt in his back. She beat at it and hammered at it, and the strange sounds in her ear was her own voice whimpering, the voice made for soft songs and foolish men, now crying and sobbing for her life. The knife was where she had struck it, squarely beneath his shoulder blades, and its blade was long, she knew. She had a passing satisfaction as one hand came away with a wet, sticky substance soiling her fingers. One giant hand came up again, and another heavy blow fell, making her ears ring and her senses reel. He was swinging his huge arms and fists at her ponderously, like a windmill. But somewhere her quickness and strength had left her, and though she could see the blows coming, she could not dodge them, and they fell with a rhythmic tattoo upon her face and shoulders and upper body. As Terry slipped to the floor, hurt and sick almost beyond caring, she had time, as though in a dream, to see that hand of hers which had touched the stickiness from his back where her knife had struck, as though, in the seeing of his life's blood on her fingers, there would be some small satisfaction. She looked and knew something that made her doubt what sanity remained in her battered head. For the almost colourless substance on her fingers, whatever it may have been, was certainly not blood. Those last seconds seemed an eternity. For a fraction of them, he left her lying where she had fallen, her clothes nearly completely ripped from her body, and he half turned for a moment, for some small reason that had nothing to do with her life or his dreadful purpose concerning it. She saw the knife end in his back, and it glinted as testimonial to her supreme failure. There was a wet stain from the rent it caused in his coat, and from that stain was more of the stuff drying on her hand, and it, too, also could not be blood. Perhaps he caught the direction of her eyes. At any rate, he reached almost casually behind him and wrenched the knife from its lodgment in his massive body. The blade came away, but there was still no redness. She was sure of that because he was holding it as he moved closer to her and bent, almost kneeled as though in supplication, the knife in his hand as offering. She was fascinated by its unreddened blade. From out of her youngness and woman strength that was far from its designed destiny or length of life, she summoned the energy to gasp, You're not human." He bent closer, ever closer, as though to kiss her, and as he did, he said,
"No, Terry, my dear, I'm not human."
There was something else in her to be said, a plea, a begging for mercy, a promise of everything, for loss of life is the greatest loss. But if she had had the strength to say it, it would still not have been said, for the beginnings of it were ripped and torn from her very throat by her own blade, as he plunged the knife into her, smashing and tearing and rending the bones and tissue and flesh of a neck that so many foolish men had worshipped. The damp man's exit from a scene of crime, or as he always called such occasions, the scene of justice, was accomplished with a minimum of effort, and, as usual, without observation. 3. Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had been involved in much more than his share of peccadilloes during his span of existence, would be involved in many more. This was his own opinion. Experience and the fortunate position of his tremendous inherited wealth had taught him that there were few scrapes from which one could not extricate oneself with the use of superior intelligence or money and influence. Some occasions took one solution, others took another, but the worst would yield to both. As time passed, in the dark patterns of his life, Lothar felt never regret, rarely sadness, but instead a kind of bitter resentment and frustration that filled the hulk of him with a burning hatred towards his less peculiarly endowed fellow men and women. His actions became less overt and direct. He became more a recluse, and in this a society which had never accepted his unusualness was glad to concur. Remsdorf, at vast expense and with the utilization of every likely means, set about collecting all the data he could on the experiments of his brilliant scientist father, Remsdorf Sr. He was, of course, primarily and overwhelmingly interested in the facts and circumstances attendant upon the experiment whose culmination produced the knowledge that was him. Much of the data pertinent to this, as well as other of his father's scientific adventures, had been destroyed in the explosion that had cost Remsdorf Sr. his life, and which, in later years, would be attributed to the son who, like Frankenstein's monster, had turned resentfully upon his maker. Other levels of information which would now be invaluable to the Damp Man's investigations had undoubtedly been gathered not on paper, but alone in the head of the scientist himself. Still, in time, Remsdorf accumulated a considerable portmanteau of details concerning the physiological, cellular, and radiary aspects of altering human tissue and the organic balance between vital substances. Through the months and the years, the Damp Man collected not only paper information and scientific data, but instruments and apparatus which he thought might eventually be useful to him. Some of these were built on unusual and outre lines, along specifications from those of his father's secret files, which he'd been able to salvage at least in part. There were two thoughts in this connection in the back of Remsdorf Jr.'s mind. One was assuredly the dominant. That was his desire to perpetuate himself and to establish on this earth others of his kind. Precisely how this would be done was the subject of many of his musings and speculations. There was, of course, the orderly method of conventional biological progression, but this was possibly a chance formula. The other was to subject additional human organisms to the same man-made tampering to which he had been subjected. And then, but only rarely, was the discreet wonder that possibly the energies that had made him what he was could be reversed, and carrying that thought to conclusion, he would therefore become what he had been once before, in some unremembered limbo. This last was not a matter he spent much analysis on, for in actuality the Damp Man had come to believe supremely in his superiority. To become one of the masses would be a recession of the most shocking sort. It was his chief problem then to find one, a female of course, who would be kindred with him, and who would help realize his dream of a racial and biological empire which could revolutionize our society, our mores and our destinies, not alone as individuals, but as a composite universe. To this end, all of Remsdorf's efforts were bent, but there still remained, with the ebb and flow of success in his scientific adventures and experimentations, the quest for a goal, the goal. And then one day, almost as by accident, he saw a picture in a newspaper. There were other faces and figures, but he had eyes for only one, the one which even the newspaper photo showed to be golden-haired, very pretty and statuesque in proportions. The young lady in question, the story read, was a Miss Linda Mallory, and she was competing in a swimming meet to be held in a near state, along with the others in the picture. Remsdorf was at that contest, and was completely taken with the girl. He watched for her entry in future meets, and through devious means ascertained her address at a big city women's hotel. His campaign to meet and win the young lady for his own could not allow for defeat. To be sure, he had run across an initial rejection early in the chase. He had come upon her at one of the fashionable club pools where swimming races were being held. As nearly as it was possible for him to be so affected, the damp man was confused by meeting face to face this statuesque, perfectly moulded, young blonde beauty. He mumbled something, although of course they had not been introduced. When he tried to remember afterward, he could not remember exactly what he had said, but the essence of it he could guess, and it must have sounded strange to the uninitiated girl.
"Between us, we can make a new world."
She had brushed past him in some embarrassment, he had recalled. There entered into the picture not long afterward a meddlesome young man by name George Pelgrim, who was, Lota had to admit, a rather wily adversary in his capacity as reporter for the big metropolitan Gazette. He too met Linda Mallory, and they became acquainted, much to Remsdorf's irritation. That she had told Pelgrim about her other admirer was evident nearly at once, for one night late in fog-filled streets he had followed them home from a movie, and had confronted the young man, who, in traditional manner, had barred the way while Linda had gone on ahead. Lota had been enjoying the prospect of beating the newspaper man's brains from his head, when car lights had shone through the yellow mist far down the avenue, and he'd had to leave Pelgrim lying unconscious from their fight in the street, but still, he was afraid, very much alive. It was, of course, a passing irritation that he had caught up with a girl some days later who he believed was Linda, for was she not wearing one of Linda's dresses, which he knew well from observation? In her fear and struggling, she had made a considerable scene at a place where such commotion can cause questions and embarrassing apprehension. Then, at once, Remsdorf realized that it was not Linda, but another girl of almost equal proportions, wearing an identical dress. By that time, there'd only been one thing to do, and Lota had done it. With the death of the mixed identity girl, the reporter Pelgrim's efforts to hinder Remsdorf had been redoubled. Still, he had plans for Pelgrim. His campaign for Linda was not ended. His race of new people would still be born. George Pelgrim laid the diary down, but there were some immensities about this macabre situation that staggered the mind. Pelgrim went back to the diary then, and pored over some of the back pages filled with calculations, summaries, equations, and formulas. Most of it was as Greek to him, but here and there were conclusions worded in scientific language, but still not too hard for the lay mind to comprehend. Pelgrim read on, and it was some time later, having exhausted the remaining pages of the journal, that he descended again into the laboratory basement of the building. It was eerie to walk in that place with its strange, damned equipment, and those three grisly things on the floor. Corpses they were. Two of them Remsdorf's gunsels who'd been brought here to guard the place, and the third, an assisting doctor in white smock, who probably knew little of what he was doing, but was willing to assist in anything for the sort of fee that Lota would be glad to pay. There was, of course, the transfusion theory of Remsdorf's experimentation, but there was also what the damp man had somewhat sardonically called in his diary the evolution stage, and that was set up here like some futuristic monster, with electrons and such arrayed in twin banks complementing each other and focusing across an X middle stage. George was still wondering about his method once he had quit this place for good, and that would be soon, for the first streaks of dawn would be upon him in another hour or two, of tipping off the police. An anonymous phone call, he thought, would do it. Simply the brusque message that there had been some trouble up at View Cliffs. The authorities would come and find the three bodies. Remsdorf, of course, was gone forever into the myriad moisture of the world. Pelgrim thought that there would be nothing to implicate Linda or himself, but any thorough investigation could not fail to give them both a clean bill of health when all the facts, supported by the precious Remsdorf diary, were established. George was less sure of the attitude of the authorities on the complete disappearance of Lothar Remsdorf Jr., but that was a matter that concerned him only theoretically. Another most practical consideration in Pelgrim's mind was how he could win approval to publish this record, the story of the infamous Damp Man and his machinations, for the yarn certainly out-thrilled fiction. As he thought, his flashlight flicked over the apparatus of the stage. It reminded him in some ways of a giant diathermy machine. To get a better look at some of the mechanics of the machine, he stepped up on the stage, peering up at neon sign-like tentacles that reached high on either side, as though to form an arbor of equipment. He was careful not to touch anything, for the exact mechanism was beyond him. This part of the Damp Man saga smacked a bit of quackery. George had the newspaper reporter's contempt of paraphernalia, and in this elaborate form it reminded him of the grade C thrillers that the movie makers put out for years for a gullible, easily impressed audience. Craning his neck to look upward made him feel suddenly dizzy. He recalled prosaically that he hadn't eaten in many hours, and that was probably the reason for the nausea and weakness that was catching up with him. Pelgrim stepped off the stage, noting the control box on the far side with its switch and the red lights that marked one end of its radius. But he was concerned now with getting upstairs. He went through the house quickly and quietly, visiting last the upstairs room, wherein hung the huge life-size portrait of Lothar Remsdorf Jr. He himself would keep the diary, but it would not do to have curious police discover the lopsided hanging picture and a small broken wall safe behind it. He straightened the picture carefully, after having seen that the safe looked as intact as he could make it. The picture of Remsdorf struck him again as it had before, powerfully and with impact. As he backed away, almost as though with awe, he changed his opinion that the eyes had no life, for there seemed a spark in them now, and the face that had been expressionless now almost seemed to smile back at him. He was feeling very, very tired, and his imagination was that of an exhausted man who'd known neither food nor sleep over too long a period. He made an exit from the room before, as he chided himself, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. should step out of the picture suddenly, come to life and pursue him through the dark, dead old building. Outside, Pelgrim made his way to his parked car, which had been left discreetly some distance away. He drove nearly all the way back to the city, before he found an inconspicuous spot with an all-night counterman dozing on duty. With his fedora down over his eyes, George went in, made his way to the corner phone booth and phoned his tip about View Cliffs. The rest was up to the police. He'd been in his city apartment only a few minutes when his phone jangled. It was Linda who'd come on ahead of him and was now safely ensconced again at Mrs. Brumley's boarding house. "Darling, are you all right?" "Of course," he told her. "You ought to be asleep at this hour." Dawn was at his windows as he spoke, although it's just about time for a new day, isn't it? They talked of this and that, and for some reason George said nothing about the diary, or of his return visit to View Cliffs. "I thought you'd been out on an all-night bender or something," she chided him. "Celebrating my near demise at the hands of that monster?" His laugh was a little hollow. It had been a close escape. For a young lady who almost contributed to an unusual experience, he kidded back, striking the same light vein. "You're remarkably gay." "It's because we're free of him," she said fervently. "Free of him forever, George. We don't have to sneak around anymore, or phone each other from pay booths and not get together for fear he's watching or following. He's gone forever, George." "That's right," said Pelgrim. "He's gone forever. Now, try and get some sleep, Linda." There were a few more endearments, and then they hung up. It was true what Linda Mallory had said. They could walk arm in arm anywhere they pleased, day or night. down bright or dark streets, without looking behind, without wondering at every step that beat him rhythm with their own, without wondering if the chance glance of a passer-by might betoken some agent directed by him. It was as Linda said, as though they had come out from under a giant cloud, as though they had walked through a dark, evil forest and emerged into the sunlight and joy of these years of youth that were still theirs. Her face was radiant as she'd look at him and squeeze his arm affectionately. "I suppose," the blonde girl would convey, "I suppose I'll never forget that business, nor you, George. I might on the surface, but not way down deep inside. They say that everything that happens to you is recorded there forever, but even now, and it's only a few weeks ago, the last of it, even now it seems a dream, like something that happened to someone else, something that I've been told about that didn't really happen to me. You know what I mean?" And George would nod his head, and Linda, like people in love, would poke at him playfully and say with mock petulance, "You're not even paying any attention to what I'm saying. You're thinking about something else. Now don't you go and grin sheepishly, George, and try and pretend you've been listening all the time. That's the trouble with you newspaper men. So many funny things happen to you. I suppose your little run-in with my damp man is sort of back-page stuff to you now." He wagged his head non-committally. "George," she went on, "what about getting some of that published? You know, you used to say it would make such a wonderful story. Won't that old city editor of yours, or the feature editor down there, take it?" He surprised her by shaking his head. "Things like that really shouldn't be printed, Linda. I agree with them now." "Well," she sighed, squeezing his elbow again lovingly. "And then they talk about women changing their minds." But George was thinking of something else, and he'd been thinking of it for several days. It came to him first, perhaps, appropriately enough. Don't they say that's when many men do their best thinking? When he was shaving at his bathroom mirror. When he left Linda this night, he went over the whole business again, and read the diary as he had before now enough times to know parts of it almost by heart. The beginning, for instance. It all fitted in nicely, and he was satisfied that he had discovered the why as well. It made him smile to recall that only tonight Linda had taken his hand across the dinner table in a downtown cafe with a gesture of affection, and then said with that little bit of mother-hen disapproval he'd always found amusing, "George, you've been working on the office safe or something. Your hands are all scratched up. No, you've been fighting with other girls. There's a nick on your face." Silly girl, but of course he had had to make sure. That time, the first time when he'd been shaving, had been so frightening, so hopefully inconclusive. You know, men cut themselves when they shave. Blood comes, is supposed to come. Then he'd remembered, thought and thought, until the memory was clear in his mind. The stage, and the apparatus, and the position of the switch on the far side. How was he to know there would be no loud, impressive hum of machinery, sparks flying, or wires glowing? But the switch had pointed to 2 red letters on its control face, 2 red letters pregnant with meaning. On. He watched. Once and a while he nicked a finger, just to make sure. He was sure. As the days had passed, though, something else had happened to him, which he supposed went with it all. For now he was no longer frightened or stunned, and he knew the next step with simple positiveness. Tomorrow he would ask Linda, and of course her answer would be yes, and that would be the beginning. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,